Imagine an ideology so vast, so incredibly influential across the entire globe, that scholars who have literally dedicated their entire lives to studying it can't even agree on what its name actually means.
Right. It really is a remarkable historical blind spot. I mean, we're looking at an ongoing, often fierce debate over 9 entirely different origins for just a single word.
Yeah, and these aren't just, minor regional variations in spelling or slight shifts in dialect.
Oh, absolutely not. We are talking about origin theories that are worlds apart. I mean, theories ranging from an obscure pre-Islamic pagan servant who dedicated his life to a temple to...
To a highly abstract Greek philosophical concept debated in the courts of emperors.
Exactly. And to, perhaps most surprisingly,
Yeah.
a very specific, very itchy, and frankly, very sweaty piece of clothing.
Welcome to this custom deep dive. If you are listening to this right now, you're someone who loves to learn. You are the kind of person who wants to get past the Wikipedia summaries and the sanitized textbook versions of history.
You want the real context.
Right. You want to understand the mechanics of how ideas actually form, but you also value your time. You don't want to drown in information overload. You want those genuine aha moments.
And today, we have a fascinating mission tailored exactly for you. We are going to explore the very foundation of a massive, globally recognized spiritual movement, Sufism.
But the way we're doing this is what makes it so compelling, I think. We aren't looking at the mainstream romanticized narrative.
No, not at all. The reason this matters to you, the listener, is because the text we are diving into today is essentially a historical bombshell. It is a deeply controversial, highly polemical attack on the movement.
Exactly. And look, as your guides today, we aren't here to tell you who is right or wrong or to, take a theological side.
Right, we're totally impartial here.
Yeah, we aren't endorsing these views, nor are we condemning any group.
Mhm.
But we are here to unpack the architecture of this specific, explosive argument.
We want to help you understand exactly what this author is arguing regarding where the term Sufi actually came from, how it supposedly hijacked a civilization, and what it originally meant in this highly critical context.
It's really about understanding the friction points of history.
Exactly. Because by examining a critique this detailed and honestly this uncompromising, we can uncover a massive amount about the historical, linguistic, and political environment in which this movement was born and evolved.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start right at the foundation of the author's premise. This text essentially frames this specific brand of extreme Sufism as a massive spiritual hijacking.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, the author argues that it started as a deviation from orthodox truth, and then during a time of widespread public ignorance, it was heavily infiltrated by this wild cocktail of foreign ideas.
That is the core thesis driving the entire text. I mean, the author outright refuses to view this extreme Sufism merely as an internal misinterpretation of Islam.
They see it as external.
Completely. They view it as an amalgamation of external philosophies that actively and aggressively infiltrated the religion. The text paints a very vivid picture of a spiritual vacuum.
What kind of vacuum? Like just general ignorance?
Yes, a period marked by a sudden lack of foundational Islamic awareness among the masses, the rise of general ignorance, and what the author calls corrupt scholars.
Oh, right. Individuals who were more interested in myth-making and personal leadership than actual theological rigor.
Exactly. And into this vacuum, according to the source, poured a multitude of foreign concepts.
Well, I want to dig into that cocktail of foreign concepts because the text gets highly specific. It isn't just, throwing around a vague accusation of outside influence to score cheap points.
Absolutely not. The author provides a really meticulous inventory of these alleged infiltrations. They point first to Shia extremism and the principles of the Batiniya.
Wait, let's pause on that term. Batiniya. I've heard it, but what does it actually mean in practice? Like, how does it change the way someone practices a religion?
So, Batiniya refers to esoteric groups who believe that religious texts and rituals have a batin,
A batin.
a hidden inner meaning. And they believe this hidden meaning is vastly more important than the zahir, which is the apparent literal meaning.
Okay, give me an example of how that works, just practically speaking.
Well, Orthodox theology says when a text talks about praying, it means actual physical prayer, standing, bowing.
Right.
A Batini approach might say, well, the physical act of bowing is just for the uninitiated masses. The true hidden meaning of prayer is simply knowing the secret name of God, or recognizing our specific spiritual leader.
Oh, wow. So it completely untethers the religion from its shared public rules.
Exactly. It makes it the exclusive property of a few enlightened individuals who hold the decoder ring, so to speak. And the author argues Sufism adopted this exact esoteric framework.
I see. So it creates an immediate spiritual hierarchy. But the text doesn't stop at the Middle East, does it? It claims this movement absorbed ideas from way outside the Islamic borders.
Oh, it goes way further. It explicitly claims that Sufism became a sponge for concepts from Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism.
All of them.
Yeah, but the text reserves its absolute heaviest artillery for the influence of ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Platonism and Neoplatonism.
Really? Greek philosophy?
Yes, the argument is that these ancient pre-Islamic and fundamentally polytheistic or pantheistic philosophies were essentially smuggled into the Muslim world.
Smuggled in and given an Islamic aesthetic.
Right, rebranded as deep spiritual truths.
And the text names names, right? It points to some major heavy-hitter figures in the Sufi tradition to illustrate this point.
It does. The author specifically targets prominent figures like Al-Hallaj, Ibn Arabi, Al-Bastami, and Al-Jili.
And what do these guys supposedly do?
According to the text, these figures, heavily intoxicated by this cocktail of foreign ideas, pushed theology to the absolute breaking point. They arrived at a concept called Wadat al-Wujud.
Correct. Or the unity of existence.
Correct.
Okay, I need you to break down unity of existence. Because if you just hear that phrase on its own or, see it on a bumper sticker, it sounds pretty standard for a lot of modern spirituality.
Yeah, we're all one, right?
Exactly. God is in everything. Why is this considered the ultimate heresy in the context of this text?
It's a crucial question. So, in Orthodox Islamic theology, the most foundational, unbreakable rule is the absolute distinction between the creator and the created.
God is distinct from the universe.
Right. God made the universe, sustains it, watches over it, but God is not the universe.
Like a carpenter who makes a table, the carpenter is not the wood.
That is a perfect analogy. But Wadat al-Wujud, as critiqued by this author, dissolves that barrier entirely.
It just erases it.
Completely. Along with related concepts like hulul, which is divine incarnation, and ittihad, union with the divine, it proposes that the physical universe is merely an emanation of God. In this view, there is only one true existence.
So instead of a carpenter and a table, it's more like, the ocean and a drop of water.
Yes, exactly that. The drop of water thinks it is separate, but ultimately it is just the ocean. The text argues that these extreme Sufis claim that God literally exists in absolutely everything.
Wow.
The author states that in the view of these figures, if a person doesn't believe that the creation actually possesses the attributes of the creator, they haven't reached enlightenment. They cannot be considered a true saint.
So from the author's perspective, this isn't just a slightly different, more poetic way of praying. It is the complete dismantling of the core monotheistic architecture.
Yes.
It's erasing the line that defines the entire religion.
Exactly. The text argues that the devil confused these followers, leading them to speak about the divine without actual knowledge, to fabricate lies, and to dress up these non-Islamic pantheistic concepts with Islamic-sounding terminology just to confuse the masses.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. And honestly, it takes a turn that I wasn't expecting at all. The text doesn't just stop at theology.
No, it zooms way out.
Right. It introduces this massive geopolitical argument. It claims that the spread of this extreme Sufism wasn't just an organic shift in how people thought. It was actively weaponized.
And encouraged by the enemies of Islam. This is perhaps the most provocative part of the author's thesis. They divide these enemies into two distinct camps.
Okay, what's the first camp?
First, you have the external enemies, foreign colonizers, empires, and forces that actively wanted to dismantle Islamic civilization and keep Muslims divided and weak.
Makes sense. And the second?
Second, and perhaps more insidiously, you have the internal enemies, corrupt, tyrannical rulers governing Muslim lands who wore the outward guise of religion but only cared about maintaining their own power and wealth.
See, I am struggling to see the logic here. Put yourself in the shoes of a corrupt ruler, say a tyrannical governor in 10th century Baghdad or Damascus. You want people working the fields, you want them paying their taxes, and if a foreign army attacks, you want them picking up swords to fight. Why on earth would you actively promote a movement of mystics who just want to sit in a room and meditate? That seems completely counterintuitive.
Well, if you look at it purely from a labor perspective, maybe. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of regime survival, the author's logic becomes chillingly clear.
How so?
Think about what this specific brand of extreme Sufism was heavily promoting. Absolute asceticism, total isolation from worldly affairs,
Yeah.
and a profound, unshakable contentment with the status quo, no matter how miserable or unjust it might be.
Ah, it's about threat reduction.
Precisely. The author argues that by encouraging the masses to focus entirely on the afterlife, to spend their time seeking blessings from the graves of dead saints, and to completely detach from politics, economics, and social justice, Sufism effectively anesthetized the population.
Because if your entire spiritual goal is to own nothing and be happy with literally nothing, you aren't going to care if the governor triples your taxes.
Exactly. It neutralized the core Islamic concept of active struggle against injustice and tyranny. In Orthodox Islam, confronting an unjust ruler is considered one of the highest forms of faith.
Right.
But if the population is convinced that true spiritual superiority lies in accepting poverty, turning a blind eye to corruption, and never challenging the ruler, then the tyrant is perfectly safe.
It's the ultimate tool of pacification. The text says they slept on the claim of asceticism. It turned a dynamic, socially engaged civilization into a passive one, living quietly on the margins of life while their leaders robbed them blind.
That is the author's grand geopolitical conclusion. The text claims the enemies of Islam, both foreign and domestic, rejoiced at the spread of Sufism because it literally paved the way for them.
It numbed the nerves of the population with myths.
Yes, numbed them with myths and esoteric rituals, removing any threat of popular uprising.
Okay, so we have this massive, sprawling ideology that the author claims hijacked the theology and completely pacified the politics of a civilization. But before we can fully grasp how an ideology gets to that point, we need to answer a really fundamental question.
The name itself.
Exactly. How did these people define themselves? Where does the word Sufi even come from?
That is the perfect question to ask, and it leads us directly into the core mystery presented in the text. The author meticulously details how scholars, both those fiercely for and violently against Sufism, and even the Sufis themselves, completely failed to agree on the origin of their own name.
It's wild. You'd think a group with that much global influence would have a rock-solid origin story. But instead, the text presents 9 completely distinct theories.
And the way the author dismantles these theories is a masterclass in linguistic and historical argumentation. Let's look at how the argument evolves. They start by attacking the theories that sound the most elevated.
The spiritual and status-based claims. So the first theory the text examines is that the word Sufi derives from the Arabic root safa, which translates to purity.
Right. The idea is that these individuals were called Sufis because they had achieved pure hearts, pure secrets, and their chests were expanded with divine spiritual light.
I mean, it sounds lovely. We are the pure ones. But the author of our text really brings out the red pen here, don't they?
They absolutely do. And to understand why, we need to take a quick detour into how the Arabic language actually works, because it's vital to the author's critique.
Lay it on me.
Arabic is fundamentally a root-based language. Most words are built from a 3-letter root that carries a core concept. Then, you plug those 3 letters into different mathematical templates to create verbs, nouns, and adjectives.
So it's less like memorizing random vocabulary and more like applying a formula.
Exactly. And the author applies a very specific grammatical formula here, the creation of a nisba, or relative adjective. When you want to attribute someone to a concept or a place in Arabic, you generally add an I sound to the end. For example, someone from Egypt, which is Misr, is Mizri.
Okay, that makes sense. So if the root concept is safa, meaning purity, and you want to say a person of purity,
The grammatical rules dictate that it must become Safi. It categorically does not become Sufi. The linguistic derivation simply fails. You cannot get from point A to point B using the laws of the language.
it's like someone claiming the word baker comes from the word bicycle.
Exactly.
Sure, they both start with a B, and maybe a baker occasionally rides a bicycle to work, but the grammatical mechanics of English just don't allow one word to spawn the other.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. But the author's attack on the purity theory isn't just about grammar. They launch a devastating theological critique as well.
Because claiming to be the undisputed pure ones seems a little, arrogant.
Highly arrogant. The author argues that claiming absolute purity of heart is something only God can know. Furthermore, claiming to be the pure ones directly violates a very specific Quranic injunction.
Really? What does it say?
The text explicitly commands believers not to praise their own piety or claim purity for themselves. The author points out that even the closest, most revered companions of the prophet never claimed such self-purity. They performed incredible deeds but remained constantly fearful that their efforts might not be accepted by God.
So to name your entire movement the Pure Ones is seen by the author as this massive act of arrogant self-justification. It contradicts the very religion they claim to be practicing.
Precisely. It fails both the grammar test and the theology test.
So once the author proves that these groups couldn't grammatically or theologically justify their own names using the concept of purity, you can almost sense the historical panic.
They definitely had to try a different angle.
Yeah. So what about the second theory?
The second theory follows a very similar trajectory. It claims the word comes from Safwa, which means the elite, or the chosen ones. The idea being that they are the elite chosen by God from among the entire nation.
Again, deeply humble. But let me apply what you just taught me about Arabic grammar. If the root is Safwa, and I want to attribute someone to it using that Nisba rule, they would be called Safawi.
You've got it perfectly. Linguistically, they would be Safawi, not Sufi. The math still doesn't add up.
Okay, so purity is out, and the elite is out. The author is systematically knocking down these pillars of spiritual boasting. What's the third claim?
Theory number 3 is Sifa, which means good traits or possessing praiseworthy characteristics while abandoning blameworthy ones.
Let me test my Arabic again. If you belong to the people of Sifa, you would be called Sifati.
Spot on. Linguistically, it must be Sifati. What's fascinating here, and the author points this out with a hint of irony, is that the term Sifati actually already exists in Islamic theology, but it refers to a completely different group of people.
Oh, really? Who were the actual Sifatis?
In the complex theological debates of early Islam, the Sifatis were those who strictly affirmed the divine attributes of God, like seeing, hearing, or having hands, exactly as they were written in the texts. This was opposed to other groups who metaphorically interpreted or denied them.
Oh, wow.
So, not only is Sifa grammatically incorrect for the Sufis, but the correct grammatical form was literally already taken by someone else entirely.
Sorry, that username is currently in use. That is hilarious. Okay, what about the fourth theory? Because it seems like they are basically running out of abstract spiritual concepts.
They are. The fourth theory is Saf, meaning the row, specifically referring to the first row. The claim is that Sufis are named this because their hearts are always stationed in the first row before God, or literally, they are the people who rush to be in the front row of the mosque during prayer.
And the grammatical verdict?
If you are from the Saf, you are Safi. The linguistic gymnastics required to turn Saf into Sufi are simply impossible.
So, think about where this leaves the movement historically. If the linguistic math absolutely refuses to work for any of these lofty spiritual definitions, purity, elite status, good traits, first-row piety people must have eventually realized this.
Oh, they did?
You can almost see the gears turning in the minds of later defenders. If they can't claim a spiritual or abstract root, they are forced to dig into the past to find a historical location or a specific founding figure. They need something tangible.
That is exactly where the text takes us next. When the abstract concepts collapse under grammatical scrutiny, the theories drastically shift to historical and even foreign associations. This brings us to theory number 5, which is perhaps one of the most fiercely debated in the entire text, al-Sufa, or the people of the bench.
Okay, I have heard of the people of the bench before, but I've only ever heard them discussed in glowing, reverent terms. Who were they historically, and why would the Sufis be so desperate to be named after them?
Well, to understand this, we have to look at the sociology of the city of Medina during the early 7th century. The Prophet Muhammad had migrated there, and soon, many poor converts from Mecca and surrounding tribes followed him.
Okay.
These immigrants had left everything behind: their wealth, their families, their tribal protection. When they arrived in Medina, they had absolutely nothing. No homes, no jobs, no money.
A massive refugee crisis, essentially.
Exactly. So, to accommodate them, a shaded area, a bench or a portico, called a sufa, was built at the back of the Prophet's mosque. These men lived there. They were known for their profound poverty, yes, but also their intense dedication to worship, as they were constantly near the Prophet and learning from him.
So you can easily see why later ascetics and mystics living hundreds of years later would look back at these poor devout men living in the mosque and say, look, that's us. Those are our founding fathers.
We are the inheritors of the people of the bench.
Right. It provides a direct, highly legitimate historical lineage straight back to the founding generation.
It's the ultimate trump card for historical legitimacy. But the author of our text completely dismantles it using a two-pronged attack. First, they throw the familiar linguistic hurdle. If you are attributed to the Sufa, grammatically you must be called Sufi, with a double F, not Sufi.
But that's just a warm-up, I assume.
It is. The author's main attack here is a devastating historical and ideological deconstruction.
Wait, hold on. Is the author going to argue that the people of the bench weren't actually spiritual role models?
The author argues that the Sufis completely, perhaps intentionally, misunderstand what the Sufa actually was. The text insists that this bench was absolutely not a dedicated permanent monastery for people who had intentionally chosen poverty as a higher spiritual path.
It wasn't a lifestyle choice.
No, it was, in stark modern terms, a temporary homeless shelter of necessity. The text points out that these men were actively seeking work. They didn't want to be there. When one of them found a job, or got married, or acquired enough money to rent a room, they immediately left the bench. They didn't stay there to achieve some elevated spiritual state through permanent destitution.
This completely flips the narrative.
It does. Furthermore, the author notes that the prophet actively encouraged these men to work, to trade, and to earn a living so they wouldn't be dependent on charity. This historical reality completely contradicts the later Sufi ideal of extreme, permanent, voluntary poverty and their reliance on the donations of the masses.
That is a fascinating critique. The author is essentially accusing them of historical rebranding. You take a highly revered group from the past, you completely ignore the painful socio-economic context of why they were sleeping on a bench, and you hijack their memory to validate your current practices.
It is retroactive validation, and the author rejects it entirely.
So the bench is out. Now, if they can't link themselves to the earliest Muslims, where do they go? The author says they reach even further back, right, to a time before Islam even existed.
Yes. Theory number 6 suggests the name comes from a specific ancient pre-Islamic man whose name was literally Sufa.
A real guy named Sufa. Okay, wait. Applying the Arabic rules, Sufa to Sufi. Grammatically, that actually works perfectly.
It does.
Why on earth does the author and the Sufis themselves apparently throw this one out?
Because the historical context is ideologically toxic. According to the text, Sufa, whose real name was Al-Ghath bin Mur, lived during the era of ignorance, the period of Arabian paganism.
Uh-oh.
His mother was barren, and she made a vow to the pagan gods that if she had a child, she would tie a piece of wool, a sufa, to his head and dedicate him entirely to serving the Kaaba in Mecca. He became the first person to dedicate his entire life exclusively to the temple service.
I see the problem. It's historically and grammatically plausible, but you cannot be a deeply devout Islamic movement and trace your entire identity back to a guy who lived during the era of polytheism.
Exactly. It's a non-starter. If the lineage were true, the author argues, it would have been widely known and celebrated during the time of the early Muslims, which it wasn't. They actively suppressed this theory because linking an Islamic identity to a pagan figure destroys their credibility.
Okay, so we've ruled out the spiritual boasting, the homeless shelter, and the ancient pagan. Now this brings us to theory number 7, and this one feels entirely different. It doesn't sound Arabic at all.
It isn't. Theory 7 argues that the word Sufi comes directly from the Greek word Sophia, meaning wisdom.
Sophia, like philosophy, the love of wisdom. This isn't just a fringe idea either, is it?
Not at all. It was championed by al-Biruni, who was a massive, towering figure in Islamic history. He was an 11th century polymath, astronomer, historian, and philosopher who spent years studying in India. He was deeply, intimately familiar with different cultures, religions, and languages. He wasn't guessing. He was making an educated linguistic connection.
And does the author of our text think al-Biruni was onto something?
The author acknowledges that the historical timing for this theory actually fits remarkably well. The term Sufi really started to gain prominence and solidify as a distinct group identity during the end of the 2nd and the 3rd Islamic centuries, primarily in Iraq.
And what else was happening in Iraq at that exact time?
The Abbasid Caliphate was funding a massive, unprecedented translation movement. Institutions like the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, were employing scholars to translate the great works of Greek philosophy, medicine, and science into Arabic.
So Greek ideas were everywhere.
Exactly. Greek words and concepts were actively entering the intellectual bloodstream of the Islamic Empire. The idea of Sophia being Arabized into Sufi makes perfect historical and linguistic sense in that specific cosmopolitan milieu.
It makes incredible sense. A group of people seeking divine hidden wisdom take on a name derived from the Greek word for wisdom exactly at the time when Greek ideas are trending in the capital city. So why doesn't this theory hold up?
Because, ironically, both the Sufis and their fiercest critics hate it, but for entirely different reasons.
Let's start with the Sufis. Why do they hate being associated with wisdom?
They don't hate wisdom, they hate Greek wisdom. The author points out that if the Sufis admit their name comes from Greek philosophy, they are essentially handing their opponents a loaded gun.
Right.
It implies that their core ideas come from Greek philosophy, which, if you remember the author's initial premise, is exactly what the critics are accusing them of. It opens them up to undeniable charges of heresy, of abandoning pure Islamic tradition, and importing foreign pantheistic ideas.
Please don't call us Greek philosophers. We are trying incredibly hard to prove we are Orthodox Muslims.
Exactly. It's terrible PR for an Islamic movement. But the text also provides a more functional, practical reason why Sophia doesn't quite fit the reality on the ground. The Greek concept of Sophia usually implies abstract, theoretical, intellectual philosophy, sitting in a courtyard thinking about the fundamental nature of existence.
Yeah, but Sufism was more hands-on.
Right. Early Sufism, in its practical application, was fundamentally about physical spiritual action, severe asceticism, and bodily practice, not just armchair theorizing. There's a mismatch in the lived reality of the terms.
So Sophia is out because it's politically dangerous and practically inaccurate. We are rapidly running out of options here. What is theory number 8?
Theory 8 takes a hard pivot away from grand philosophy and lands in the dirt. It claims the name comes from Sufana, which is a type of short, fuzzy, relatively obscure desert weed.
A desert weed. We went from the Greek love of wisdom to a weed. What is the logic here?
The argument suggests that the early ascetics who fled the cities for the wilderness ate so meagerly, surviving only on whatever they could forage in the harsh desert environment, like this specific weed, that the general population simply named them after their diet. The weed eaters, essentially.
Let me put on my grammar police badge one last time. If you are named after the Sufana plant, you would be Sufani.
Yes. Grammatically, it fails. Furthermore, the text dismisses this theory with a touch of dry sarcasm. The author notes that if you actually walk up to most practicing Sufis and ask them about this, they have absolutely no idea what a Sufana plant even looks like. It's an obscure botanical reference, not a foundational identity.
Okay, this is an incredible journey the author has taken us on. We have sifted through 8 distinct theories. We've seen the author systematically demolish claims of spiritual purity, elite status, and front-row piety. We've watched them deconstruct the romanticized, rewritten history of the Prophet's homeless shelter, reject the pre-Islamic pagan servant, discard the Greek philosophical connection, and laugh off the desert weed.
It's pretty comprehensive.
It feels like we've eliminated everything noble, everything historically profound, and everything foreign. What could possibly be left?
We have finally arrived at the 9th theory. After all the lofty claims, the desperate historical retrofitting, and the complex linguistic mental gymnastics, the author concludes that the only academically supported, linguistically perfect, and historically sound theory is also the most glaringly mundane.
Lay it on me.
The word Sufi comes from the Arabic word self.
Self, which means wool.
Yes, a heavy, rough, itchy piece of wool.
So after all that grand theological debate, they are quite literally just the wool wearers.
Exactly. And the text makes sure to emphasize that this isn't just the author's fringe opinion. This specific origin is supported by the absolute heavyweights of Islamic scholarship across centuries.
Like who?
Including the fierce theologian Ibn Taymiyyah and the legendary historian and sociologist Ibn Khaldun.
Okay, let's put it through the author's rigorous testing matrix. How does wool fare on the Arabic grammar test that just destroyed almost everything else?
It passes with absolute flying colors. The author explains that the linguistic derivation here works perfectly without any forced formulas. Just as you say takamas for someone who intentionally puts on a kamis, which is a shirt, you say tasawwuf for someone who intentionally puts on sakalis, wool.
So it's just a verb structure.
Yeah, the verb structure describes the act of donning the garment. It's flawless.
Okay, grammar check passed. But we need to explain the historical and cultural context here. Why was wearing wool such a defining, radical characteristic that it literally named an entire global movement? Today, wool is just a nice, expensive sweater you wear in the winter. What did it mean in the Middle East in the 8th or 9th century?
Put yourself in that geography and climate. In the blazing heat of the Middle East, rough, undyed wool was the clothing of the absolute poorest of the poor. The shepherds, the destitute, the wealthy, the scholars, and the average citizens wore cotton, linen, or if they were rich enough, silk. By actively, intentionally choosing to wear a thick, rough wool cloak instead of comfortable cotton, These individuals were making a loud, highly visible public statement.
It's a protest against comfort.
Exactly. It was a physical rejection of worldly luxury, a public embrace of extreme humility, and practically speaking, a constant, itchy, uncomfortable reminder to the physical body to ignore worldly pleasures. The text even quotes the famous Arab poet Abu Firas al-Hamdani to beautifully illustrate this stark cultural contrast.
I love when texts bring in poetry to make a point. What does he say?
The poet is addressing a wealthy patron or ruler, and he says, "You and your soft garments, how can you change them? While our clothes are of wool, we will never change them."
That's intense.
It perfectly captures the profound pride, almost the arrogance, that these ascetics took in their rough clothing. It was a badge of spiritual toughness against the perceived softness and corruption of the worldly elite.
And the text has that incredible anecdote to back this up, right? The story about the hunter, I think that's the single most memorable part of this whole section.
Yes, it is a brilliant inclusion by the author because it perfectly illustrates how central, how utterly vital the woolen cloak became to their identity. The text recounts a historical encounter where a man approaches a famous early ascetic and asks him, "Are you selling your woolen cloak?" And the ascetic immediately replies, "If the hunter sells his net, what will he hunt with?"
Wow. If the hunter sells his net, what will he hunt with? Let's pause and really think about what that implies. It means the cloak isn't just a piece of clothing to keep the sun off. It is a tool. It's a net designed to catch something.
Exactly.
Now, generously, maybe it's a net to catch spiritual gains or discipline. But if we are looking at it through the highly critical, cynical lens of the author, is it a net designed to catch the admiration, the donations, and the reverence of the gullible masses?
That is precisely the dark ambiguity the author wants to highlight. And this leads us directly into the author's fascinating, devastating counter-narrative regarding the actual practice of wearing wool. Even though the author entirely agrees that wool is the true origin of the name, they launch a massive theological attack against the act of wearing it as a spiritual discipline.
Wait, I'm confused. They just established that wearing wool was the ultimate symbol of humility and asceticism. It's proof that these guys were tough. Why attack the practice?
Because the text argues that intentionally wearing rough wool for the purpose of scoring spiritual points is not an inherently Islamic practice. The author provides clear, documented evidence that the Prophet Muhammad, who is supposed to be the ultimate example for all Muslims, actually preferred to wear soft cotton and linen.
He didn't wear wool.
Usually not. The text explicitly mentions a type of decorated Yemeni cotton cloak called a haibara as one of his absolute favorites.
So the author is essentially pointing a finger at them and saying, you claim to be the ultimate spiritual followers, the most elite practitioners of the faith. But your defining physical characteristic, the very thing you named yourselves after, goes directly against what the prophet himself actually preferred to wear.
Exactly. And the text goes even further to drive this point home with a very specific, almost visceral historical report. It notes a tradition where the prophet's wife, Aisha, once made him a thick, black woolen cloak. He put it on out of appreciation, but when he began to sweat in the heat, he intensely disliked the harsh smell of the wet wool, and he immediately took it off.
He didn't like the smell.
Right. The text notes that he loved good sense and cleanliness. The author uses this very human story to show that fetishizing uncomfortable, smelly clothing was absolutely not the prophetic way.
Okay, so if this intense obsession with wearing itchy wool didn't come from the prophet's example, where does the author speculate they got the idea? They didn't just invent it out of nowhere.
This is where the text brilliantly ties back to its initial, overarching premise of foreign infiltration. The author points out that intentionally wearing rough wool, or hair shirts, was actually a deeply established Christian monastic tradition.
Oh, like the Desert Fathers.
Exactly. Christian monks and extreme ascetics living in the deserts of Syria and Egypt have been wearing coarse wool as a form of bodily self-mortification long before Islam ever arrived in the region.
So the author is arguing that this isn't just an innocent, slightly misguided fashion choice. It is another blatant example of importing a foreign religious practice, slapping an Arabic name on it, and trying to pass it off as elite Islamic piety.
That is the core accusation.
Yeah.
And the text backs this up by quoting early Orthodox Islamic scholars who fiercely recognized this and criticized the practice in real time. The author cites figures like Hamoudin Abi Suleiman, who once saw a Muslim man walking around wearing a heavy wool garment and bluntly told him, "Take off this Christianity of yours."
Wow, just call him out.
Yeah. Or the great scholar Sufyan al-Thawri, who walked up to a wool wearer and told him, "This clothing of yours is a bidah," an unacceptable foreign religious innovation.
They saw right through it. They saw it as performative. It was ninth century virtue signaling.
Performative is the exact right word. The text quotes another early scholar who cuts right to the heart of the psychological issue. He said, "Asceticism used to be inside the heart. Now it's on the outside of the clothes."
Ouch.
The author's ultimate argument is that the wool cloak became a costume. It became a way to publicly broadcast a fake outward poverty and holiness, while the inside of the person might be entirely corrupt or arrogant.
If the hunter sells his net. That quote hits so much harder now. Okay, so we have finally solved the etymological mystery. We've dug through the mathematical weeds of Arabic grammar. We firmly rejected the Greek philosophers and the obscure desert plants, and we have landed squarely on the itchy, smelly reality of a woolen cloak. A cloak that the author forcefully argues was a performative, imported, non-Islamic tradition.
We know the origin of the word.
But that only tells us where the word came from. It doesn't tell us what the actual thing is in practice. If you walk up to a Sufi on the street today, or 1,000 years ago, and ask them, okay, beyond the wool cloak, what is Sufism actually? What do they say?
Well, according to the deep dive provided by our source text, if you asked 1,000 different Sufis that exact question, you would quite literally get 1,000 different answers.
1,000 different answers. That's not a coherent religious ideology. That's a spiritual Rorschach test. How can a movement survive if no one agrees on what it is?
The text actually makes this point explicitly to highlight the movement's instability. It states that there are over 1,000 distinct definitions of Sufism recorded from its various prominent historical figures, and the author takes the time to explain why there is such a dizzying, contradictory variety.
Why is that?
Every prominent figure defines Sufism based on their own personal, momentary, highly subjective spiritual state. Or they define it based on the specific psychological or social flaw they were trying to fix in their disciples at that exact moment in time.
So it wasn't a static set of rules like orthodox law. It was a highly individualized, constantly shifting internal landscape.
Precisely. It was reactionary and subjective.
But the author must organize this chaos somehow for the reader, right? They can't just list 1,000 quotes and say, look how confusing this is.
No, the text systematically categorizes these quotes to demonstrate the incredible, almost contradictory spectrum of what this ideology claimed to be. Let's walk through the major categories the author provides to see how wildly the definitions swing.
All right, let's map this out. What is the first major category?
The first category focuses on absolute, uncompromising asceticism. For example, the text quotes a prominent figure named Sumnan, who defines Sufism with brutal simplicity, that you do not own anything and nothing owns you.
Nothing owns you. That is a powerful concept. It's not just about emptying your bank account or living in the woods. It's about breaking all emotional and psychological attachments to the material world. It's seeking freedom through extreme total detachment.
Exactly. It's poverty as liberation. But then, the text immediately shifts to a second category, defining Sufism not through poverty, but through internal morals and purity. He quotes Al-Shibli, who said, Sufism is simply sitting with God without worry.
Sitting with God without worry. That completely ignores the poverty aspect. It's purely psychological. It's about achieving a state of perfect internal clarity, removing all mental distractions so that the heart is entirely peacefully focused on the divine presence.
Right. But then the author introduces the third category, which highlights the massive internal tension within the movement, the relationship between this ecstatic spiritual struggle and the Sharia, the strict orthodox religious law.
This is what I was wondering. How do you balance ecstatic, detached meditation with the requirement to pray in a specific physical way exactly 5 times a day? Where do the rules fit in?
The author explores this by quoting Al-Junaid, who is considered one of the most foundational, sober figures in early Sufism. Junaid tried to rein in the chaos by defining it this way. Sufism is a house, and Sharia is its door.
Sufism is a house, and Sharia is its door. Okay, think about the practical application of that architectural metaphor. It means you absolutely cannot get into the house of deep, esoteric spiritual experience without first passing through and respecting the strict door of orthodox religious law. It's a boundary.
Exactly, a boundary.
It seems like Junaid was actively trying to stop the movement from spiraling into the heresies the author mentioned earlier.
That's a highly astute observation, and it perfectly highlights the historical friction the author is documenting. Some figures wanted no rules, others tried to enforce the door. The fourth category the text focuses on is total submission and sincerity. The text quotes Ruwam, who defines Sufism as letting the soul go with God Almighty on whatever he wants.
It is the ultimate surrender, giving up every ounce of personal desire, every preference, so that only the divine will remains. It's the total death of the ego.
Yes. Which leads perfectly to the final category the author emphasizes, the complete and utter rejection of formality. And to highlight this, the text quotes Al-Junayd again. If you see a Sufi caring about his outward appearance, know that his inside is ruined.
Oh, that is brilliant. The author is using Junaid's own definition as a weapon against the movement. Because if you care enough about your outward appearance to intentionally put on a specific itchy woolen costume just to show everyone how ascetic and detached you are, you have already ruined the internal sincerity you are trying to display. You are caught in the hunter's net of your own ego.
It is a devastatingly structured critique. The author presents this vast, chaotic array of definitions to show how subjective, potentially unstable, and easily corrupted the ideology is. But to synthesize all this disparate data and bring the argument home, the text relies on a master definition provided by the great historian Ibn Khaldun.
Ibn Khaldun is a heavyweight. How does he sum up this thousand-headed hydra?
Ibn Khaldun's definition, as cited approvingly in the text, strips away the poetry and distills Sufism down to its core historical and sociological reality. Devotion to worship, total detachment from the world, rejecting the wealth and status the masses chase, and isolating oneself from creation to be alone with the Creator.
Isolating oneself from creation. I want to pause here because that phrase just brought this entire deep dive full circle. We started this hour with the author's explosive geopolitical claim that this movement was actively encouraged by corrupt rulers and foreign colonizers because it effectively pacified the masses. And now, at the very end of this dense linguistic and definitional journey, we see exactly how it did that.
The connection is undeniable.
If your absolute highest spiritual goal, as defined by your own leaders, is to isolate yourself from creation, to own nothing, and to submit entirely to whatever happens without worry, you are not going to be out in the public square protesting an unjust king. You are not going to fight back when the governor steals your land. You are going to be sitting quietly in your room, wearing your itchy wool, trying to sit with God.
You have perfectly connected the theological definitions back to the author's initial geopolitical premise. The text masterfully argues that the very mechanisms of spiritual purification demanded by Sufism were the exact same mechanisms that neutralized social, economic, and political resistance. The pursuit of the inner world led to the complete surrender of the outer world.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's recap the incredible journey we've been on. We started with a fierce critique of a movement that supposedly anesthetized entire nations. We dug deep into the mathematical roots of Arabic grammar.
We rejected the theories of Greek philosophy, homeless shelters, and obscure desert weeds.
We landed on the itchy, smelly reality of a performative woolen cloak, and we navigated a chaotic ideology that demands the absolute death of the ego.
The journey through this specific text reveals just how deeply complex the intersection of language, history, and theology truly is. The author has shown us through rigorous argumentation that words are never just words. They carry the immense weight of ideological and even geopolitical battles.
Exactly. How does any movement, historical or modern, balance between genuine, quiet internal growth and becoming an outward performative net to hunt for social status? Whether you are navigating the latest corporate buzzwords in your office or trying to understand massive historical shifts, understanding the deep roots of the words people use to define themselves gives you the ultimate decoder ring to their true intentions.
The author of our source text heavily and effectively criticized the act of wearing the woolen cloak. They saw it not as a symbol of genuine poverty, but as a calculated performative display, a way to signal virtue, toughness, and holiness to others while potentially hiding a ruined, corrupted interior. And I think that forces us to ask a difficult question about our own context.
I always love when history holds up a mirror. What's the question we should be asking ourselves?
It makes you wonder, what are the woolen cloaks we wear today? Think about it. In our modern world, where we constantly and obsessively curate our identities online, where we craft highly specific personas for the workplace or our social circles, what outward nets are we putting on? Are we performing minimalism? Are we virtue signaling our political purity? What modern costumes are we wearing to signal our own elite status or specific virtues to the world? And ultimately, if we are wearing those nets, what are we actually trying to hunt?
So imagine you go out and you plant a tiny acorn in the ground, right?
Okay.
You expect it to do what acorns usually do, like grow into a sturdy, totally predictable oak tree.
It's something normal.
Right. And then you step away, you just go about your life, and centuries later, you return to that exact same spot.
Let me guess, it's not an oak tree.
Not even close. It's like this massive, sprawling, tangled jungle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, there are these vines choking the original trunk and exotic birds you've never even seen before nesting in the canopy.
Right.
People are literally building elaborate fortified castles up in the branches, and then there are folks standing at the base claiming the tree allows them to, walk on air.
That is quite the mutation.
It's a chaotic, vibrant, honestly slightly terrifying ecosystem. And you look at it and you have to ask, how on earth did a simple acorn become this?
It's basically the ultimate question of evolution, isn't it?
Exactly.
And, it applies just as much to human ideas as it does to biology.
Yeah, totally.
Because you start with something small, right?
Mhm.
Something rooted in very clear, very simple intentions.
But then time happens.
Right. Time, vast geographical expansion, cross-cultural collisions, and just the deeply complex architecture of human psychology.
It's messy.
Very messy. The original idea doesn't just grow, it mutates to survive. And in doing so, it often turns into something the original planters wouldn't even recognize.
And that transformation, that mutation, is exactly what we are dissecting today for you, the learner.
Yes, we've got an incredibly dense stack of sources for this deep dive.
We really do. We've got historical and theological sources in front of us, and our mission today is to trace the evolutionary timeline of one of the most famously complex movements in global history.
Sufism.
Right. We're going to look at the granular mechanics of how a movement goes from individuals seeking very simple, quiet piety in the deserts of Arabia
To a massive, heavily institutionalized global network.
Yeah, where people are claiming to transcend physical laws or completely abandon all religious obligations or even like fake clinical insanity just to outmaneuver local politicians.
It is a wild, unpredictable trajectory. But before we start plotting points on this timeline, I think we really need to establish the precise lens through which we are viewing this history today.
Yes. This is absolutely crucial for you to know, the learner. The context of our sources is everything here.
Definitely.
Because the sources we're unpacking today, they do not represent like a neutral Wikipedia summary.
Not at all.
No, they present a highly specific, deeply critical, orthodox theological viewpoint on the history of Sufism.
Right. The authors of these texts are looking at that sprawling jungle you just described, and they are emphatically stating, this is not the oak tree. This is a severe corruption.
Yeah, they frame so many of the historical developments we're going to explore as dangerous innovations or philosophical deviations or just outright heresies.
Which they felt threatened the structural integrity of the original faith. We are essentially stepping into a freely polarized historical debate.
A very heated one.
The authors of these texts are basically acting as prosecutors. They're meticulously building a case against the later stages of this movement.
By tracing its lineage and identifying exactly where they believe, the train just went totally off the tracks.
Precisely. And to be completely clear with you, the listener, our job today is not to sit on the jury.
Right, we aren't taking sides here.
No, we aren't endorsing these critiques, nor are we defending the mystical traditions against them. We aren't theologians.
We're acting as your analytical guides today. We're going to step inside the worldview of these specific critics to understand their logic.
To unpack their historical arguments and figure out exactly why they view this timeline as a story of ideological decay rather than, say, spiritual ascension.
It's an exercise in deep historical empathy, really.
And critical analysis. Because if we want to understand the anatomy of a critique, we have to dismantle the arguments piece by piece.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we want to understand how a movement mutates, we have to start at the absolute beginning.
Or at least where the movement claims its beginning is.
Right, exactly. Because according to these critical sources, the very origin story of Sufism, the foundation myth, is the subject of a massive, heavily contested historical battle.
Every great movement requires an origin myth, right? Whether it's a religion, a nation-state, a philosophical school.
They need that Genesis moment that validates their whole existence.
Yeah, and the texts we're analyzing spend a significant amount of intellectual energy just aggressively dismantling the specific Genesis story claimed by early Sufi historians.
So the narrative championed by prominent Sufi scholars and the texts explicitly name figures like Suhrawardi and al-Manufi is that Sufism didn't just evolve centuries later.
Right, they argue it originated right at the dawn of Islam.
In Medina, during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself, they trace their lineage directly to a specific group known as the al-Sufa.
Which translates to the people of the bench.
The people of the bench. Now, to understand the intensity of this debate, we kind of have to reconstruct the socioeconomic reality of early Medina, don't we?
We do. Let's set the historical stage here. When the early Muslims migrated from Mecca to Medina to escape persecution, an event known as the Hijra.
It created an immediate, basically catastrophic housing crisis.
Exactly. You had this massive influx of refugees arriving in a new city with absolutely nothing.
Because they had left everything behind, right? Their homes, businesses, wealth.
Often their extended families, too. They were entirely destitute. Medina was largely an agricultural city, and these refugees were primarily merchants from Mecca.
So they didn't even have the right skill sets for the local economy.
Right. They had no land, no immediate way to make a living, and nowhere to sleep. So the community had to improvise what was essentially a homeless shelter.
A shaded area, right, like a raised platform or a bench.
Yes, a sufa, constructed at the rear of the Prophet's mosque. And this became the temporary living quarters for these impoverished immigrants.
Okay, so here is where the historical narratives violently diverge.
Very violently.
The Sufi scholars, according to our texts, they look back at the al-Sufa and frame them as the first true intentional mystics.
They argue that these companions chose this life of grinding poverty.
Right. They claim it was about extreme isolation and worldly detachment. Like the romanticized narrative is that these guys voluntarily turned their backs on the material world.
To sit in the mosque and engage in constant, uninterrupted spiritual contemplation.
They basically frame the bench not as a homeless shelter, but as the first spiritual retreat center.
But the critical texts we're reading absolutely hammer this narrative. I mean, they tear it apart.
How so?
They argue that this connection is a retroactive fabrication. It's a deeply romanticized myth designed to serve a later political and theological purpose.
So they're saying the al-Sufa were not voluntary ascetics practicing a philosophy of mystical poverty.
Not at all. The authors meticulously argue that they were simply desperate refugees who literally had nowhere else to lay their heads.
And the detail the sources really emphasize here is the concept of intent, right?
Yes, intent is everything in this argument.
The texts argue this wasn't some permanent, desired lifestyle. It was a temporary, agonizing circumstance.
They point to historical records showing that these people actively, aggressively sought employment in the local markets.
They were looking for day labor gigs.
Exactly. And as soon as an individual found a job or managed to save enough money to get married and rent a small room,
They vacated the Sufa immediately.
They didn't cling to the bench as some sort of elevated spiritual station. They wanted out of poverty just as much as anyone else would.
And the critics use the foundational teachings of the faith to undercut this Sufi origin story too, don't they?
They do. They argue that elevating permanent, intentional poverty to the highest spiritual ideal directly contradicts the behavioral model established at the time.
Right. They cite specific traditions, like the one where the prophet taught that the strong believer is better and more beloved to God than the weak believer.
And they also point to a very famous economic maxim from that era. The upper hand is better than the lower hand.
Which means?
The upper hand being the one that produces wealth and gives in charity, and the lower hand being the one that is forced to receive it.
Wow. That economic dynamic completely shatters the romantic myth, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Because if the core teaching of the community is that producing wealth to help others is superior to relying on others for your daily bread,
Then framing the destitute guys on the bench as the absolute pinnacle of spiritual achievement just doesn't align with the historical reality.
Exactly. The authors are basically saying, look, these men weren't sitting in the dirt trying to achieve mystical annihilation of the ego.
They were hungry, displaced people hoping to afford a meal.
Right. So the analytical question we have to ask ourselves, and the question the sources are implicitly answering, is why?
Why would later generations of mystical scholars work so incredibly hard to retroactively claim these guys as their founders?
Even bending historical context to do it. Why do they need this story?
Well, it's entirely about securing unassailable religious legitimacy, isn't it?
Absolutely. In the architecture of early Islamic theology, proximity is power.
Right. Proximity to the origin, to the prophet, to that first generation that is the ultimate currency of authenticity.
If a philosophical movement that develops hundreds of years later, absorbing all sorts of complex foreign ideas, can somehow tie its core identity back to that sacred first generation.
It effectively insulates itself from orthodox criticism.
Exactly. It's a brilliant if historically questionable defensive strategy. You ground your highly controversial practices in the undisputed bedrock of the religion's genesis.
You know, reading this section, it immediately made me think of modern corporate culture, specifically like massive tech companies.
Oh, how so?
Think about a modern billion-dollar Silicon Valley titan today. They have a sprawling global campus, tens of thousands of employees, massive HR bureaucracy,
Needs of corporate lawyers, yeah.
and billions in revenue. Yet their marketing department will aggressively push the narrative that they still possess a garage startup culture.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
They'll deliberately put raw plywood desks and ping pong tables in the break room to manufacture this romantic, gritty aesthetic.
Right, because they want the raw authenticity and the disruptive street cred of the two guys in a garage origin story to validate their current massive power structure.
It's exactly the same mechanic. The later, heavily institutionalized Sufi scholars are trying to claim the garage startup authenticity of the al-Sufa.
That is a remarkably precise analogy. They need the grit and the perceived purity of those early, impoverished companions to validate a movement that becomes incredibly wealthy and structurally complex.
But I want to push back on the critics' argument for a moment, just to make sure we're exploring all the angles presented in the text.
Please do.
The sources acknowledge another origin claim made by Sufi historians, one that goes even higher up the chain of authority than the companions.
Right, they claim their ascetic model is based on the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Specifically citing his time isolating in the cave of Hira, right, before he ever received the first revelation. Didn't he deliberately remove himself from the bustling commerce of Mecca to seek deep, silent contemplation in a mountain cave?
He did.
So doesn't that historical fact perfectly mirror the isolationist mystical practices that later Sufis championed?
Yeah.
Seems like a strong argument.
It's a very strong counter-argument.
Yeah.
And the authors of our critical sources know they have to address it head-on, which they do.
How do they handle it?
Well, they readily acknowledge the historical reality of his isolation in the caves, but they fundamentally reject the attempt to use that specific period as a universal template for a permanent religious doctrine.
So they dismantle the connection. It seems like a pretty straight line from the prophet meditated in a cave to we should meditate in caves.
The text argues that this is a profound misreading of the trajectory of his life.
Okay.
The authors frame the time in the cave as a highly specific, divinely orchestrated period of preparation. It was a transitional charging station, not the final destination.
So the intense isolation was necessary to prepare his psychological constitution for the weight of receiving revelation.
Exactly. But the crucial analytical point the sources hammer home is what happened after the revelation began.
He didn't stay in the cave.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Once the prophetic mission began, he completely abandoned the monastic lifestyle. He didn't establish an order of hermits on the mountain.
Right. He immediately descended back into the intense, messy, friction-filled reality of human society.
He integrated. He led armies, negotiated treaties, governed a rapidly expanding city-state.
He engaged in daily commerce, dealt with hypocrites, criminals, political rivals.
He was entirely consumed by the horizontal obligations of human community, not just the vertical obligation of divine contemplation.
So the Orthodox critics are arguing that the Sufi narrative essentially takes a temporary pre-revelation preparatory phase, freezes it in amber, and falsely elevates it to the ultimate goal of the religion.
That is their exact argument. They contend that his ultimate mature example was one of dynamic engagement with the world, not perpetual withdrawal from it.
Okay, so if we follow the rigorous logic of these specific critics, Sufism did not start with the impoverished refugees on the bench, and it was not mandated by the temporary isolation in the cave.
The origin myth is thoroughly deconstructed, according to the text.
So if it didn't start there, when, where, and how did this movement actually begin?
To answer that, the sources pivot from theology to linguistics and historical sociology, and the first major paradigm shift they introduce is a linguistic one.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
The very word Sufi was completely unknown to the first generation of Muslims. It simply did not exist in the cultural lexicon.
I found this deeply surprising. You assume a movement this massive has owned its title since day one. If the word didn't exist, how did the early community categorize people who were exceptionally devout?
The text points out that in the first century, individuals who exhibited extreme piety weren't given a distinct mystical title. They were simply referred to using standard Arabic descriptors for their behavior.
Like what?
They were called zuhad, which translates to ascetics, people who actively renounced worldly pleasures, or they were known as Bakain.
The Weepers. That's a very evocative title.
It is. It describes a psychological state of being so overwhelmingly aware of moral accountability and so fearful of divine judgment that it produced a constant, visceral emotional reaction.
So they literally wept out of fear of God.
Yes. But importantly, being a Zahid or a Baka didn't mean you belonged to a separate esoteric sect. It just meant you were taking standard Orthodox religious warnings very, very seriously.
So when does the brand name actually show up?
The actual term Sufiya, or Sufi, doesn't emerge in the historical record until the late 2nd century, after the Hijra.
So we have a gap of almost 200 years before the word even appears. Where does the text say the word actually comes from? Because the sources outline this incredibly long list of rejected etymologies.
It highlights the intense desire for linguistic legitimacy.
It's almost comical how many different noble roots people tried to attach to the word.
The sources detail how later apologists tried to forcibly link the word Sufi to Safa, which means absolute purity, or to Saf, referring to the people who stand in the first row during congregational prayer.
Implying they are the spiritual vanguard.
Exactly. Some even tried to link it to Safwa, meaning the chosen elite of God. They even tried to connect it to a pre-Islamic tribal figure named Sufa, or a specific desert plant called Sufana.
It's just linguistic gymnastics. But the authors of our texts, relying on strict rules of Arabic morphology and grammar, dismantle every single one of those claims.
They prove that linguistically, it is impossible to derive the word Sufi from purity or the first row. The grammatical math just doesn't work.
So what is the mundane reality? What root do they actually accept?
The most historically and linguistically sound origin, which the critical sources concede, is that the term derives simply from the Arabic word suf, and suf means wool.
Wool, just the basic fabric.
Yes, but we have to understand the sensory and social context of wool in that specific time and climate.
Right, because we aren't talking about a soft, tailored merino wool sweater here.
No, we are talking about coarse, raw, unwashed, brutally scratchy sheep's wool. The defining, visible characteristic of these emerging mystics was their aggressive, highly public rejection of standard clothing.
Because the elites of the expanding empire were beginning to wear fine Egyptian cotton, right? And imported silk.
Exactly. While everyone else was enjoying these new luxuries, these individuals deliberately chose to wear heavy, suffocating wool in the blistering heat of the Middle East.
It's a form of physical mortification. You are ensuring that you are never physically comfortable. The scratch of the fabric is a constant sensory reminder to reject the softness of the material world.
It was a permanent, highly visible physical statement of rebellion against the growing wealth of the Islamic Empire. But here is where the critical text introduces a massive historical curveball.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
The authors argue that this specific practice, donning coarse wool to achieve spiritual elevation, was not a spontaneous, organic Islamic invention.
No, they track the footprint of this behavior directly outside the borders of the faith. They point straight to Christian monasticism.
And to understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at the geographical realities of the 7th and 8th centuries.
As the early Muslim armies, merchants, and administrators expanded out of the relatively isolated Arabian Peninsula, they swept into places like the Levant, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt.
And when they arrived, they didn't find empty deserts.
Right.
They bumped into highly established, centuries-old religious traditions. The collision of cultures is the engine of historical change.
And the most prominent, visually striking religious figures they encountered in these new territories were Christian monks, right? Living in extreme isolation in desert monasteries.
Yes. The text argues that early, highly pious Muslims observed these monks. They saw them living in severe, intentional deprivation, completely withdrawn from society, practicing lifelong celibacy.
And crucially, wearing the traditional coarse wool robes of the ascetic monastic orders.
So the sources are suggesting a kind of spiritual osmosis. These highly devout Muslims saw the extreme dedication of the Christian monks and thought, if we want to be truly devoted to God, we should mimic that level of intense physical sacrifice.
So they adopted the heavy wool, they started retreating into extreme isolation, and they began flirting with the concept of Rabbania, the Arabic term for monasticism.
And the authors of our Orthodox sources are absolutely furious about this cross-cultural borrowing. They view it as a catastrophic contamination.
The texts actually quote prominent early Islamic scholars who would physically confront Muslims wearing these ostentatious wool robes in the street.
Yes, literally commanding them to Take off your Christianity.
That's an incredible historical detail. Take off your Christianity. It shows how clearly the contemporaries recognized the foreign origin of the practice.
The critics argued that this extreme, punishing monasticism is a direct violation of the balanced, holistic approach established by early Islam.
A system that explicitly demands taking care of the physical body, participating in marriage, and actively working to sustain a local economy.
It is a fascinating clash of foundational values. The critical sources are charging these early proto-Sufis with importing an entirely foreign religious paradigm and forcibly attempting to graft it onto the trunk of Islam.
But the text doesn't stop at the Levant. The Christian influence is just the first foreign footprint they track.
Right.
The sources then take us further east, diving deep into Hindu philosophy, and further west into ancient Greek thought. And they bring in a massive intellectual heavyweight to make this point.
Yes, the text relies heavily on the historical and anthropological analysis of al-Biruni.
Al-Biruni is such a fascinating figure. For those who might not know, you, the learner, he was an 11th century polymath, historian, astronomer, and anthropologist.
He's famous for literally traveling to India, embedding himself in the culture, learning Sanskrit, and writing a massive, incredibly objective encyclopedia about Hindu religion and philosophy.
He was a scientist of culture. He was uniquely positioned to spot cross-cultural pollination.
He understood the intricate details of both Islamic theology and Hindu metaphysics. And according to the critical sources we're reading, al-Biruni argued that the core foundational philosophical concepts of later Sufism,
Specifically, the esoteric ideas about the human soul eventually merging with or becoming entirely indistinguishable from the divine reality.
have direct, undeniable roots in Hindu philosophy. Ideas like Advaita Vedanta or non-dualism, which predate Islam by thousands of years.
And the text also connects the linguistic debate back to Greek philosophy, too. It suggests that while the word Sufi might derive from wool, there's a strong possibility that it's also a deliberate Arabicized play on the Greek word Sophia.
Which means wisdom.
Right. The implication is that these mystics weren't just poor ascetics in wool, they were philosophers seeking Sophia, an esoteric wisdom that transcended standard religious law, much like ancient Greek mystics.
This hypothesis aligns perfectly with the historical timeline the sources lay out. The text notes that these complex mystical ideas didn't emerge in a vacuum. They really began to flourish during the height of the Abbasid translation movement in Iraq.
Primarily during the late 2nd and 3rd centuries. Let's paint a picture of that era. You have the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
The caliphs are spending absolute fortunes to bring texts from all over the known world to be translated into Arabic.
You've got ancient Greek texts on Neoplatonism, complex Persian theological tracts, and incredibly dense Indian spiritual manuals, all flooding into the intellectual centers of the Islamic world.
It was an era of unprecedented intellectual ferment. You have markets and study circles where a Muslim scholar, a Christian translator, a Jewish philosopher, and a merchant who just returned from the Indus Valley are all interacting.
In that environment, ideas don't stay in neat, compartmentalized boxes. They bleed into one another.
A pious ascetic sitting in Basra might hear a concept derived from a translated Greek text about the emanation of the soul, and slowly, organically, integrate that concept into his own Islamic spiritual vocabulary.
I have to pause here and speak directly to you, the learner, because this is one of those profound historical aha moments.
It really is.
It is absolutely staggering to realize that deep, complex globalization and rapid cultural exchange were happening 1,000 years ago, and that this exchange was fundamentally rewiring how people practice their religion.
We tend to think of globalization as a modern, internet-driven phenomenon.
But here you have extreme ascetic practices from the deserts of Syria, the ancient metaphysical philosophy of Athens, and the non-dualistic spiritual traditions of India, all violently colliding in the bustling streets of Iraq a millennium ago.
Creating an entirely new, deeply complex spiritual ecosystem. It's a perfect illustration of the acorn in the jungle.
The early simple intent of piety was exposed to the rich, complex soil of global philosophy.
However, we must remember the perspective of our sources. The texts we are reading view this monumental cultural collision not as an intellectual enrichment, but as a fatal contamination of the original, pure theological message.
Okay, so we've dismantled the origin myth, and we've tracked the influx of foreign philosophical ideas. Now, the critical text provides us with a remarkably structured chronological timeline to map this mutation.
It breaks the evolution of Sufism down into 6 distinct consecutive stages.
I want to spend the remainder of our deep dive rigorously walking through the mechanics of each of these stages because it provides a brilliant blueprint of exactly how that simple acorn turned into an unrecognizable jungle.
The six-stage framework is a highly effective analytical tool utilized by the authors. It allows them to demonstrate how tiny, incremental behavioral shifts compounded over centuries inevitably lead to a total paradigm shift.
Let's approach this by grouping the stages conceptually. We'll call phase A, piety and passion. This phase encompasses stages 1 and 2, where the shifts are subtle but foundational.
Stage 1 is categorized by the text as transcendence from materialism. Historically, this spans the very first century and the early part of the second century.
The sources explicitly highlight the Rashidun caliphs, the first four political and religious leaders who succeeded the Prophet, men like Abu Bakr and Umar, as the prime historical examples of this first stage.
Now, it is vital to note that the Orthodox critics actually approve of this stage entirely.
Really? They don't have a problem with it?
No, in fact, they don't even categorize it as Sufism. They consider it to be nothing more than standard, proper, pristine Islam. The defining essential characteristic of stage 1 is the concept of balanced asceticism.
Balance is the operative word. How do they define that balance in practice?
It's the ability to interact with the material world without being consumed by it. The caliphs like Umar were known to be incredibly austere. They wore patched, simple clothing and ate the most basic food, even while commanding massive armies.
But, and this is the crux of the critical argument, they did not reject the physical world entirely.
No, they didn't abandon their posts to retreat to a mountain cave. They maintained a rigorous, demanding balance between the eternal needs of the soul and the immediate rights and responsibilities of the physical body and the community.
They governed massive populations, managed complex state economies, engaged in warfare, married, raised children.
They were psychologically detached from the love of worldly power, but they remained deeply actively engaged in the management of the world.
Right. They weren't wearing coarse wool just to put on a public performance of how exceptionally holy they were. They were simply practical, deeply focused on ultimate accountability in the afterlife.
They viewed material wealth as a distraction, not an inherent evil. It's a very grounded, functional piety.
But human nature struggles to maintain that kind of nuanced balance, which leads us directly into stage 2, imitation of predecessors.
This shift occurs in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries. And this is where the tectonic plates of the theology begin to slowly shift.
In stage 2, the psychological focus subtly shifts away from a natural, internally balanced piety. It moves toward a highly conscious, rigid, and increasingly severe adherence to ascetic practices.
The intention starts to become a bit more performative. You begin to see historical figures who actively and completely walk away from their worldly responsibilities to pursue spiritual purity.
The text briefly mentions Ibrahim bin Adham here, a famous figure who essentially lived out a localized Buddha narrative, abandoning his wealthy, aristocratic life to become a wandering ascetic.
But the figure in stage 2 that requires our deepest analytical attention is the legendary female mystic, Rabia al-Adawiyya.
Rabia al-Adawiyya is arguably one of the most pivotal figures in the entire history of Islamic mysticism. Her theology marks a profound, irreversible turning point in how the individual relates to the divine.
The text provides some of her most famous quotes, and they are incredibly striking.
I want to read one of them for the learner right now to give a sense of her voice. She famously declared, "I have not worshipped him out of fear of his fire or out of greed for his paradise so that I would be like a bad employee. I worshipped him out of love for him and longing for him."
Let's dissect the profound psychological and theological shift happening in that single statement. It is a complete reimagining of the foundation of the human-divine relationship.
It is a total paradigm shift. Prior to this moment, the standard Orthodox religious motivation, even for the incredibly pious figures we discussed in stage 1, was deeply rooted in the literal Quranic promises of heaven and the terrifying warnings of hell.
Religion was fundamentally about duty, moral obedience, the legitimate fear of divine punishment, and the rational hope for eternal reward.
Exactly. The Orthodox system is built on a framework of cosmic justice and accountability.
But Rabia radically introduces the concept of absolute, unconditional, intoxicating divine love as the sole valid metric of faith.
She is essentially arguing that worshiping God simply to secure a spot in paradise or to avoid the flames of hell is entirely transactional. It's mercenary.
It's the behavior of a bad employee just working for a paycheck.
True. Elevated worship, she argues, must be driven solely by an overwhelming, passionate love for the Creator himself, completely divorced from any concept of personal reward or punishment.
The text also includes a beautiful, highly influential piece of her poetry concerning what she calls the two loves.
Yes, she writes, I love you with two loves, a love of passion and a love because you are worthy of that. As for the love of passion, it is my being preoccupied with remembering you to the exclusion of all else. And as for the love you are worthy of, it is your lifting of the veils until I see you.
From a literary standpoint, it is stunning, emotionally resonant poetry, but we must analyze this through the lens of our critical source texts.
To the Orthodox scholars reading this poetry, massive warning bells are starting to ring.
Huge warning bells.
But why? To the modern ear, it sounds incredibly beautiful, pure, and deeply devoted. Why would an Orthodox scholar view an expression of profound love as a threat?
Because of what it fundamentally destabilizes. This theology of pure love moves the metric of religious success away from objective external adherence to communal law and relocates it into the realm of highly subjective, deeply internalized, divine romance.
Right.
When the ultimate goal of the religion becomes an all-consuming emotional passion and the esoteric lifting of veils to see God, you are actively stepping away from the stabilizing structure of standard religious duty.
You are entering a realm of extreme, unchecked individualism.
The critical sources view this shift from objective law to subjective emotion as the fatal seed that eventually germinates into the absolute lawlessness of the later stages.
In their view, when personal feelings supersede objective law, the structural foundation of the religion begins to crack.
And that structural cracking leads us violently into phase B of our timeline, ambiguity and anarchy.
This covers stages 3 and 4. And folks, this is where the philosophical mutation becomes truly dangerous, according to the texts.
Stage 3 is meticulously defined by the critical authors as the entry of ambiguous words. We have now moved into the 3rd and mid-4th century.
The passionate, emotional poetry of love from stage 2 begins to harden into complex philosophical concepts.
And these concepts are incredibly difficult to pin down logically, making them highly controversial and deeply threatening to the Orthodox establishment.
The prime example the text provides to illustrate this era is a highly influential mystic named Abu Yazid al-Bistami. And the specific philosophical concept he introduces into the ecosystem is called fauna.
Fauna is perhaps the single most crucial piece of terminology to understand in this entire evolutionary timeline. It translates roughly to annihilation, extinction, or passing away.
Let's explain the mechanics of that. Annihilation of what, exactly? What is being destroyed?
The annihilation of the self, the complete destruction of the human ego, the dissolution of individual identity.
Al-Bastami argued that the ultimate final goal of the mystic, the true knower, is to become so completely, utterly consumed by the overpowering presence of the divine reality that their own separate human existence ceases to be.
The boundary between the creator and the created evaporates. They lose their individual identity entirely, merging seamlessly into the infinite identity of God.
Think of a single drop of water falling into a massive ocean. The drop no longer exists as an independent entity.
It's an incredibly heavy philosophical concept, and the text notes that as al-Bastami claimed to achieve this state of fauna, he began using language in public that absolutely shocked the general populace and horrified the Orthodox scholars.
Because logically, if you genuinely believe your individual self has been completely annihilated and only God remains, the things you say out loud are going to start sounding dangerously close to claiming that you are God.
The historical sources record several of these ecstatic, controversial utterances, which are categorized in Islamic theology as shatiyat.
When a mystic, allegedly operating in a state of absolute fauna, shouts something like, "Glory be to me, how great is my majesty," or "There is nothing in this robe but God,"
The Orthodox legal scholars hear nothing but blatant, inexcusable blasphemy.
the mystic's defense is that it is not their human ego speaking. Their ego is dead. They claim it is literally God speaking through their annihilated physical form.
But to the rigorous authors of our critical texts, this defense is the ultimate heresy. They view it as the direct realization of the Hindu concept of non-dualistic merging with the divine, imported directly into the heart of Islamic theology, destroying the fundamental creator-creation divide.
Which brings us to the terrifying illogical conclusion of this philosophy in stage 4, liberation from Sharia, or the complete liberation from religious obligations.
We are now fully entrenched in the 4th century, and if stage 3 was characterized by shocking, ambiguous words, stage 4 is defined by shocking, destructive actions.
The internal logic of this stage is incredibly dangerous, but from the perspective of the mystic, it is entirely, flawlessly consistent.
If my individual self is truly annihilated, and I am now completely unified with the absolute divine reality, the Hakika, then why on earth do I need to follow external human laws, the Sharia?
The argument is that religious laws, rituals, fasting, and daily prayers are training wheels.
They are disciplinary tools meant for ordinary, spiritually immature people who still possess an ego that needs to be tamed. The mystic argues, I have transcended the ego, therefore the laws no longer apply to me.
I see the horrifying logical leap. If I have merged with God, God does not need to pray to God.
The text specifically highlights a figure named Al-Wasiti here, who explicitly argues this point. He claims that his silent internal state of continuous meditation is vastly superior to the physical, vocal, structured prayers legally required by Orthodox Islam.
He is essentially stating that his advanced internal state renders the external rituals entirely unnecessary, and perhaps even views them as a rudimentary distraction.
And this philosophical stance is what the critical sources define as ibahiyya. It translates to antinomianism, or absolute lawlessness.
It is the deeply held belief that one has achieved a spiritual state that exempts them from all moral, societal, and religious legislation. This is a profound moment of realization. Are the sources genuinely arguing that this quest for deep, internalized mysticism inevitably mutated into absolute practical lawlessness?
That is exactly the terrifying, inevitable conclusion the sources draw.
If a group of people truly believes they are completely one with the divine, the very concept of human morality dissolves, doesn't it?
When subjective internal feeling, esoteric unveiling, and personal revelation are elevated to supersede established, objective external law, all the protective guardrails of society and religion are instantly removed.
The texts offer severe warnings that this fundamental philosophical shift inevitably led to horrific, destabilizing practices on the ground.
They describe later historical gatherings where groups of Sufis would utilize ambiguous, hypnotic, rhythmic chanting to intentionally induce a state of trance and lost consciousness.
In these states, they would shatter profound social, sexual, and religious taboos, entirely justifying their actions by claiming they were operating on an elevated spiritual plane where those archaic rules simply did not exist.
And the absolute poster child for this era of chaos, according to the critical text, is the infamous historical figure Al-Hallaj.
Now, for anyone who has even a passing familiarity with Sufi history, Al-Hallaj is usually portrayed as the ultimate tragic, romantic mystic.
He is the man who was brutally executed by the state for declaring, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, which is the direct name of God.
In popular literature, he's often painted as a martyr who was killed by rigid legalists because his love for God was too profound for them to comprehend. But our specific source texts paint a radically, violently different picture of the man.
The Orthodox texts frame Al-Hallaj not as a misunderstood, lovelorn saint, but as a highly dangerous, deeply cynical charlatan. They view him as a political agitator and a literal trickster who weaponized the language of mysticism to gain power.
The illustrative details the text provides here are absolutely wild. The sources claim he was heavily involved in esoteric alchemy and literal, premeditated stage magic designed to deceive an incredibly gullible public.
Listen to the mechanics of this specific trick the text outlines. The authors claim Al-Hallaj would secretly travel out into the barren desert days in advance and painstakingly bury stashes of food and water in highly specific, unmarked locations.
Then later, he would gather his devoted followers and lead them on a grueling journey deep into that same unforgiving desert.
You can see the psychological manipulation building. He creates a scenario of extreme physical distress.
Exactly. He waits until the followers are completely desperate, exhausted, and terrified of dying of thirst. At the moment of peak psychological vulnerability, he would dramatically halt, pretend to receive a sudden, divine intuition, point to a seemingly random patch of sand, and command them to dig.
And inevitably, they would uncover the food and water he had planted days before. To the exhausted, terrified followers, it was a profound, undeniable, literal miracle.
It was absolute proof of his direct, unmediated connection to the divine will.
But to the authors of our critical sources, it was a cold, calculated, deeply cynical con job. It was a psychological operation designed for one specific purpose: to secure absolute, unquestioning psychological control over his disciples.
It's the ultimate form of spiritual manipulation. It immediately reminds me of the mechanics used by fake psychics or cult leaders today.
They use techniques like hot reading, gathering secret information about a target beforehand, and then reveal it publicly as a spiritual vision to exploit a person's genuine, desperate human desire for connection with the divine.
It's using cheap, calculated parlor tricks to bypass a person's rational defenses and gain total control over their life.
And that concept of control, is the analytical key to understanding this entire historical progression. What the critical sources are meticulously tracking is a massive structural shift in where power resides.
In stage 1, with the early caliphs, spiritual and societal power belonged to the objective law and the consensus of the community.
But by the end of stage 4, power has been entirely wrested away from the law and now rests exclusively in the hands of the individual charismatic mystic, a man who claims a direct, unmediated, unquestionable link to God, verified by supposed miracles that defy human investigation.
Which perfectly and somewhat terrifyingly sets the stage for Phase C of our evolutionary timeline, institutions and insanity.
We are now entering stages 5 and 6, where the individual charlatan turns into a massive, organized bureaucracy.
Stage 5 is defined as the crystallization of the tariqas, a process that truly gains momentum from the 5th century onwards. A tariqa is the Arabic term for a formal Sufi order, a highly structured spiritual brotherhood.
Up until this point in the timeline, we have largely been discussing individual solitary mystics, a guy in a wool robe in the desert, or a charismatic figure with a small, localized group of disciples in a marketplace.
But in stage 5, the sprawling jungle really starts to organize itself into an inescapable canopy.
The mystical movement becomes heavily, rigidly institutionalized. You witness the emergence of massive, highly structured international organizations founded by incredibly famous, influential figures like Al-Jilani, Al-Rifai, Al-Badawi, and Al-Dasuki.
These are no longer informal, temporary study circles. These are sprawling corporate networks of spirituality.
They have strict internal hierarchies, highly codified unique rituals, designated real estate-owning meeting houses known as zawiyas or khanqahs, and they begin to wield massive, undeniable political, economic, and social influence across the empire.
And the claims of miracles, the karamat that were used by individuals like Al-Hajj, completely explode into overdrive during this institutional era.
The text notes that this is the period where you start hearing widespread, officially sanctioned, globally accepted claims of sheikhs routinely walking on air, commanding and communicating with invisible jinn, physically existing in 2 geographical locations simultaneously, and possessing comprehensive knowledge of the unseen future.
But the most critical foundational shift in stage 5, according to the deeply concerned authors of our sources, is the radical alteration of the interpersonal relationship between the follower, known as the murid, and the leader, the sheikh.
Right. It ceases to be a traditional inquisitive student-teacher dynamic where a scholar teaches you a text and you debate it. It mutates into a demand for absolute, terrifying, unquestioning submission.
The critical text literally quotes a terrifying axiom from this era, stating that the follower must render themselves like a corpse in the hands of the washer when dealing with their sheikh.
You cannot question their commands. You cannot express doubt. You are not even allowed to harbor a private internal thought that contradicts the sheikh's will, because the sheikh is now viewed as the literal, infallible conduit of the divine.
It is the ultimate, terrifying centralization of spiritual authority over the human mind. If you convince a human being that they must be a corpse, you have stripped them of their God-given agency and rational intellect.
And with that level of intense institutionalization always comes strict conformity. The text highlights a fascinating, highly visible sociological detail regarding Ahmad al-Badawi, the immensely powerful founder of the Ahmadiyya order in Egypt.
His followers weren't just required to obey, they were required to adopt a highly specific, standardized uniform. They all wore distinctive, color-coded red turbans.
Red turbans. The visual irony is just absolutely staggering.
We've traced this movement from early, impoverished ascetics who wore whatever rough, colorless wool they could scavenge as a desperate protest against societal norms, to a massive, organized, wealthy institution where every member is required to wear a branded, color-coded uniform to broadcast exactly which specific spiritual franchise they belong to.
It has become the exact thing it originally rebelled against.
It perfectly encapsulates the paradox of institutionalizing a mystical anti-establishment movement. The initial raw impulse to break free from the rigid constraints and bureaucracies of the material world inevitably, given enough time in human nature, creates its own rigid, powerful, worldly structures to sustain itself.
And somehow, that incredibly rigid corporate structure of the tariqas manages to encompass and protect the absolute chaos of our final evolutionary stage. Stage 6. The era of the Majadib.
Historically, we are looking at phenomena peaking around the 9th and 10th centuries and beyond. Let's define this term because it's crucial.
Majadib is the plural form of the Arabic word majhub. Linguistically, it translates literally to the drawn one or the attracted one.
In the complex terminology of late-stage Sufism, it refers to an individual who has been so overwhelmingly, violently pulled toward the intense reality of God that their fragile, rational human mind completely shatters.
To any outside objective observer, they appear to be completely clinically insane. But within the theological framework of the movement, their madness is viewed as the ultimate badge of divine selection.
And the specific historical examples the critical text provides of these venerated madmen are deeply disturbing, bizarre, and chaotic.
It details the actions of a highly revered figure named Abu al-Khair al-Kulaybani. This man supposedly reached such an elevated, untouchable spiritual state that he used his unquestioned authority to command his followers to go into the local market, purchase the most expensive, high-quality meat available, and feed it entirely to the feral stray dogs wandering the city.
All while the actual human citizens of the city were starving and suffering from severe poverty.
The internal, esoteric justification for this madness being that a true mystic, someone whose ego has been annihilated in the divine reality, sees absolutely no ontological difference between a human being and a stray dog, as both are equally manifestations of God's will. Therefore, traditional human morality is irrelevant.
It's an inversion of basic empathy. Then the text details another figure, Ahmad al-Majdub. His daily practice consisted of literally sitting in the dirt of the public marketplace and aggressively, violently screaming at merchants and innocent passers-by until they relented and gave him their hard-earned money and their food.
And the tragedy is the people actually did it. They handed over their livelihoods because the culture had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe his psychotic behavior was undeniable proof of extreme holiness. They were absolutely terrified of angering a man they believed had a direct hotline to the wrath of God.
So we have to pause and ask the fundamental analytical question. What does this all mean? How do the authors of our sources, who are highly rational, rigorous, orthodox scholars, explain this bizarre, widespread societal phenomenon of venerating abusive madmen?
This is, without a doubt, the most brilliant and fascinating part of the text's entire analysis. Because instead of taking the easy theological way out, instead of simply dismissing them by saying they are possessed by demons or they are evil heretics, the text provides an incredibly sharp, pragmatic, sociological, and deeply psychological breakdown of who these Majahid actually were in reality.
The critical sources deploy an impressive level of sociological observation. They categorize these supposedly divine madmen into three very distinct, very tragic, highly human categories.
Group 1. The political fakers.
The text argues, quite convincingly, that a significant number of these Majahid were completely, entirely sane individuals who were actively, consciously pretending to be crazy. And why would they do that? It was a survival mechanism.
It was a desperate strategy to escape the wrath of tyrannical sultans, corrupt police forces, and rigid orthodox judges. If you were a political dissident, or if you were preaching a theology that was highly controversial and likely to get you executed, the absolute safest, most effective way to protect yourself was to act completely unhinged.
The political authorities wouldn't waste their time executing a raving madman, and simultaneously, the credulous common people would protect and revere you as a saint. It was pure political survival theater masquerading as elevated mysticism.
That is a brilliant historical insight. It's weaponized insanity. Group 2. The mentally ill. Here, the text shows a surprisingly modern understanding of human frailty.
It recognizes that many of these figures were not faking it, nor were they divinely inspired. They were suffering from genuine, severe, permanent psychiatric illnesses. They were displaying symptoms of deep clinical depression, severe schizophrenia, or extreme psychosis.
But because the overarching societal culture had been so heavily primed by centuries of Sufi narratives to view irrational, bizarre behavior as a symptom of divine absorption, these desperately ill individuals were never offered medical or communal help. Instead, they were venerated.
Their tragic psychiatric symptoms, their hallucinations, their incoherence, their lack of hygiene were actively interpreted and celebrated as miracles.
It's a profound tragedy of misdiagnosis on a societal scale. And finally, the text identifies Group 3, the traumatized.
The sources describe individuals who suffered from severe, albeit temporary, psychological breaks. These were regular people who experienced sudden, catastrophic trauma, the loss of a family, extreme financial ruin, or even the devastating psychological effects of engaging in the extreme starvation-level asceticism promoted by the orders.
They simply lost their willpower and their rational faculties for a period of time. They snapped under the pressure. And once again, instead of receiving compassionate care to restore their minds, their psychological breakdown was eagerly categorized by the community as a supreme spiritual achievement.
Hearing all of this laid out, analyzing the mechanics of how a society responds to this, it forces us to ask an incredibly important question. What does it actually say about the health and the trajectory of a civilization when the ultimate markers of spiritual success become literally indistinguishable from the tragic symptoms of severe mental illness or the cynical manipulations of political theater?
It speaks to a profound, potentially terminal societal shift in foundational values. By meticulously demystifying the concept of divine madness and offering these grounded psychological and sociological explanations, the critical source text is essentially delivering its final, devastating argument.
They are concluding that by stage 6, the movement had completely, utterly lost its center of gravity. It had strayed so incredibly far from the rational, balanced, law-abiding, community-focused origins of early Islam that it had mutated into a system that actively worshipped chaos, disease, and deception.
Okay, the learner. Let's take a deep breath, step back, and survey the incredible, sprawling historical arc we have just traveled,
Yeah.
guided step by these specific, highly critical orthodox sources.
We started at the absolute root, examining a heavily romanticized foundation myth about impoverished refugees seeking shelter on a mosque bench, and debating the true implications of a prophet seeking temporary solitude in a mountain cave.
We watched how an early, highly functional, balanced asceticism, practiced by men who simultaneously ran vast, complex, global empires, slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted into the passionate, individualistic, emotional love poetry of figures like Rabia.
And we meticulously traced how that intense emotional passion mutated into the dangerous, destabilizing philosophy of absolute ego annihilation. We saw how the internal logic of Fana inevitably birthed the alleged trickery, stage magic, and total lawlessness of figures like Al-Hallaj, who genuinely believed their spiritual state elevated them far beyond the reach of human morality and law.
From there, we watched the chaotic, individualistic movement organize itself to survive. It built bureaucracies, it mandated red turbans, it established strict hierarchies, and it demanded the terrifying, absolute intellectual submission of its followers to spiritual masters who claimed the ability to walk on air and read the future.
And finally, the timeline deposited us in the dusty reality of the medieval marketplace, watching a misguided populace venerate clinical insanity, severe trauma, and calculated political theater as the ultimate, highest manifestation of God's love. We literally watched the simple acorn mutate into a deeply complex, structurally problematic, unrecognizable jungle.
It is a breathtaking, sobering trajectory. But the true value of analyzing this specific historical critique is realizing that the pattern is universal.
If you trace the lineage and the life cycle of almost any massive, enduring global movement, whether it is a major world religion, a revolutionary political ideology, or even a sweeping cultural shift, you will very often find this exact same 6-stage sociological life cycle at play.
It almost always begins with a pure, simple, fiercely idealistic idea. It gains passionate followers. It begins to question and dismantle the established rules. To survive its own growth, it is forced to institutionalize.
And eventually, tragically, the massive institution begins to validate, protect, and even revere behavior that the original idealistic founders would have absolutely abhorred.
It's the tragedy of human momentum. And it leaves us with a really profound, slightly unsettling question for you to mull over as we conclude today's analysis.
Is the eventual chaotic institutionalization of eccentric, irrational, or even rebellious behavior an inevitable, unavoidable, hardwired flaw of human group psychology? If those early, balanced Rashidim caliphs running the state, or even the desperately poor folks sitting quietly on the al-Sufra bench in Medina, could somehow look through the corridor of time and witness the 6th stage of this timeline, if they could see the screaming, abusive madmen in the market being worshipped as saints, would they even recognize it as belonging to the same religion they practiced?
It's a haunting question, and it's one that applies far beyond the specific history of Sufism. It's a fundamental question about how human beings build, how we inevitably corrupt, and how we desperately attempt to sustain our most deeply held belief systems over the long arc of history.
It forces us to examine the roots of our own deeply held structures. The learner, thank you for bringing us such an incredibly fascinating, deeply multi-layered stack of critical sources today. It takes genuine intellectual courage to look critically and objectively at the evolutionary timelines of massive, deeply held beliefs. Keep asking those hard, uncomfortable questions. Keep looking for the mechanics behind the myths, and keep rigorously interrogating the historical narratives you encounter in the world. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.
Imagine a man in 8th century Baghdad. He's sitting in absolute pitch blackness.
Right, just total sensory deprivation.
Exactly. He is starving himself, and there's this rhythmic chanting spilling from his lips. He's repeating a single syllable over and over until, the edges of his reality blur and he actually begins to hallucinate.
And the fascinating thing is, if you interrupted him right then and asked what he was doing, he would likely tell you he was practicing a purely internal, deeply orthodox form of his faith.
But if you look closely at the highly specific text we're analyzing today, you would find the architectural blueprints for that exact practice hidden, well, not in his own tradition. They're buried in ancient Jewish mysticism.
Yeah, and echoing in Christian desert cells.
Right. And even inscribed on the cave walls of Indian yogis. It's wild.
The contrast there between the internal belief of the practitioner and the external map of history is just jarring. I mean, when we usually study massive religious movements, we look for a single foundation stone, right?
Yeah, we want it to be neat.
Exactly. We want the history to be visible, neatly categorized, chronologically simple. But stepping into the world of spiritual history, particularly the origins of mysticism, that clean architectural blueprint becomes utterly useless. We're suddenly navigating this chaotic, intersecting maze of global philosophies.
Which makes this the absolute definition of an intellectual archaeology expedition. So welcome to today's deep dive, where you and I are grabbing our metaphorical shovels.
We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We're looking at a highly specific, incredibly detailed section of a broader text that analyzes the origins of Sufism. And the core premise the author is putting forward here is explosive.
It really is.
Yeah, they're saying Sufism was not born in a vacuum. The text argues that it was heavily influenced by and deliberately absorbed a massive global tapestry of ancient foreign philosophies and pre-existing religions.
A tapestry that spans from the Mediterranean all the way to the edges of East Asia, honestly. The text we are examining operates as a historical map, tracking the migration of highly specific mystical technologies across centuries and across continents.
But before we unroll that map, we need to establish a very clear ground rule for you, our listener, because the source text we're analyzing today is not, it's not a neutral historical overview.
Not at all. It is highly opinionated.
Very much so. It contains fierce theological critiques. It is written from a strict, orthodox Islamic perspective, and the author's explicit argument is that these foreign influences corrupted the original faith.
Right. They view these outside ideas as dangerous innovations.
Exactly. Now, we are your completely impartial guides today. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the text's theological critiques, nor are we condemning them.
The goal today is entirely analytical. We are just unpacking the author's fascinating historical claims about the mechanics of cultural and philosophical exchange. We want to understand how this author believes these diverse global ideas collided, synthesized, and eventually camouflaged themselves within a new religious framework.
So here is our roadmap for the journey. We'll start with how the darkened rooms of Jewish mysticism provided the literal technology of trance.
Which is a crazy concept on its own.
Right, but that still leaves a massive piece of the Sufi puzzle missing, which is the aesthetic of suffering. Like, how did a religion that explicitly commanded its followers to engage with society suddenly produce men who wore scratchy wool and refused to eat?
For that, we will travel to the Christian deserts of the Levant.
Yep. And from there, we will follow the trade routes to the intense physical disciplines of Indian yoga, head further east into the abstract realms of Chinese philosophy, and finally return to the Mediterranean to see how Greek Neoplatonism provided the intellectual software to run all of this hardware.
It's a massive journey. And the author begins it quite close to the geographic and theological home of early Islam, looking at the oldest Abrahamic tradition in the region.
Which makes sense chronologically.
It does. They argue that as early Muslims expanded into newly conquered lands, particularly in the Levant and Iraq, they collided with established, deeply rooted Jewish esoteric traditions.
And the text specifically points to these places called Mesfayat. And when I read that, I try to picture the actual historical reality on the ground.
It's a fascinating scene to imagine.
Right, because you have this new, rapidly expanding Islamic civilization, fresh from the desert, suddenly governing massive cities. Cities that are filled with communities that have been practicing secret, esoteric rituals for centuries. The author argues the boundaries between the conquerors and the conquered were highly porous.
Absolutely. The text highlights a specific practice within these mesfayat called kahana, which translates roughly to divination or a specialized form of mystical priesthood. And the critical detail the author latches onto here is the environment. Kahana was specifically practiced in darkened rooms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The author draws a bold, direct line between these ancient Jewish practices in pitch-black spaces and the Sufi practice of isolation, the khalwa, where a mystic retreats into a dark, enclosed cell to seek spiritual unveiling.
The physiological mechanism here is what is truly fascinating to me. Sensory deprivation is not just a cultural quirk. It is a universal biological trigger for altered states of consciousness.
Because of how the brain reacts, right?
Exactly. If you place a human brain in absolute darkness for an extended period, it craves stimulation so desperately that it begins to manufacture its own. You get visual and auditory hallucinations.
It's basically a biological hack.
Yes. The author is suggesting that this specific neurological hack was observed by early Muslims, absorbed from their Jewish neighbors, and then given an Islamic veneer.
And the text anchors this claim with a specific historical case study, which I found really compelling. This figure, Al-Harith al-Damashqi.
Tell us about him.
So he lived during the Umayyad era, specifically around the time of Abd al-Malik bin Marwan. Damashqi engaged deeply with these mystical currents, and the psychological effects were so profound that he eventually tipped over into claiming actual divine prophecy.
Wait, really? He claimed to be a prophet.
He did. He was executed for heresy, but the author uses him to demonstrate how volatile this intellectual frontier was. The exposure to these intense mystical technologies was actively warping the orthodox boundaries of the early Islamic community.
And it wasn't just about sitting quietly in the dark either. The text dives heavily into the physical exertion of worship. The author compares the physical movements of Sufi dhikr, the rhythmic chanting, the hyperventilation, the synchronized swaying, the dancing directly to Old Testament worship practices.
There are very clear parallels there.
Yeah, they cite explicit references to praising God with tambourines, dancing, strings, and flutes. The author is essentially holding up a Jewish historical text in one hand, pointing to a Sufi gathering with the other, and saying, look at the physical vocabulary. It is identical.
Well, this brings us back to the idea of mystical technology. How do human beings deliberately induce ecstasy?
Right.
If you combine hyperventilation from repetitive chanting with the driving, hypnotic beat of a tambourine and synchronized group movement, you effectively bypass the prefrontal cortex.
The logical, rational part of the brain.
Exactly. You induce a state of trance. The text's argument is that early Sufis didn't invent this physical technology. They imported it wholesale from Jewish mystical communities who had been refining it for centuries.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. I like to use a cultural osmosis analogy. When cultures live side by side, their practices naturally bleed into one another. Does the text argue this was a conscious borrowing by early Sufis, or just inevitable cultural blending?
The author definitely leans toward a more active, almost invasive blending. It's less like mixing two colors of paint and more like a virus entering a host cell.
Oh, that's a strong comparison.
Well, the text suggests these foreign mystical practices entered early Islam, hijacked the theological vocabulary of the faith, and began replicating themselves under a new Islamic-sounding name.
Okay, I see what you mean.
We see this acutely in the concept of the divine spark. The text traces a genealogy showing how the veneration of holy figures, the idea that a specific human carries a literal physical spark of the divine, moved from Jewish mystical thought into certain early Shia sects.
And then from there, it morphed into these Sufi reverence for sheikhs and awliya, the same.
Precisely. And the theological friction there is massive because it represents a complete migration of authority.
How so?
Well, in Orthodox Islam, ultimate authority is entirely decentralized from living humans. It rests in the text, the Quran, and the recorded traditions of the Prophet. But the text argues this imported concept of the divine spark's centralized authority into the physical body of the sheikh.
Ah, so the sheikh is no longer just a teacher.
Right, he becomes the living, breathing conduit to God.
So if the darkened rooms and the rhythmic chanting of Jewish mysticism provided the technology to reach a trance state, we have to look at the visual presentation of these mystics. Because suddenly, in the middle of the Islamic Empire, you have men deliberately living in abject poverty.
Wearing terrible clothing, refusing to marry.
Exactly. And this brings us to the Christian connection. Because moving from the physical exertion of Jewish mysticism, we are now looking at the physical deprivation of Christian monasticism.
Right. As the Islamic conquest moved deeply into Sham, the Levant, the landscape was heavily dotted with Christian monasticism. The text describes early Muslims encountering Christian monks living utterly isolated lives in deserts, on mountaintops, and in strict cells.
which the text refers to as sawami.
Yes.
And the visual markers of these encounters are so striking. The text argues that the very aesthetic of the early ascetic Muslim was lifted straight from these Christian desert fathers.
Like wearing rough, scratchy wool.
Yeah, exactly. The author even notes that this might be the actual linguistic origin of the word Sufi, derived from suf, the Arabic word for wool.
It's a very common etymological theory. Wearing rough wool, donning patched garments known as the maraqwa, practicing celibacy, engaging in extreme, prolonged fasting. These were the defining characteristics of Christian monasticism.
And they were adopted almost perfectly.
They were. The text points out that some early pious Muslims were so deeply influenced by this aesthetic that they were explicitly dubbed monks by their peers.
Like Uwais al-Qarani, right?
Yes, a highly revered early figure who was famously known as the monk of the Ummah.
But the author goes far beyond just pointing out similar clothing or fasting habits. They bring out direct textual receipts from the Gospels to argue that core Sufi concepts are essentially Christian theological ideals wrapped in Arabic terminology.
The textual parallels they draw are really specific.
They really are. They cite the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 20. "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." The author argues this specific verse is the direct, undeniable root of the fundamental Sufi concept of faqr, or spiritual poverty.
And then the author takes that textual mapping even further with Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 and 26. Look at the birds of the air, they do not sow or reap.
The text draws a straight line from that gospel verse to the extreme Sufi concept of tawakkul.
Which is fascinating because in early Islam, tawakkul meant a balanced reliance on God. You trust in God, but you tie your camel.
Right, you still have to do the work.
Exactly. But the text argues the Sufi version of tawakkul morphed into an absolute passive reliance on God, to the point where mystics would refuse to work for a living, directly mimicking the Christian ideal of the birds who neither sow nor reap.
Which introduces a glaring historical paradox.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Early Orthodox Islam famously and explicitly rejected monasticism. The principle that there's no monasticism in Islam was foundational.
It was a core tenet.
Yeah. The religion demanded a balance. Pray deeply, but also engage in commerce, marry, have children, and participate in civic life. So how does the author explain a practice that was explicitly banned, slipping past the guardrails of the faith and becoming a dominant spiritual force?
The text frames this adoption as a desperate psychological reaction to historical trauma. We really have to ground ourselves in the reality of the late First and Second Islamic centuries.
It was a very turbulent time.
It was a period of absolute whiplash. You have a society that within 50 years goes from a harsh, egalitarian desert existence to ruling half the known world. Suddenly they are drowning in Byzantine gold and Persian silk.
And simultaneously, this explosion of wealth was accompanied by horrific political bloodshed, civil wars among the early Muslims.
Imagine the cognitive dissonance. You are told your faith is pure and simple, but you look around and the leaders of your community are living in palatial estates with running water, assassinating each other for political power.
For intensely pious individuals witnessing this, the sudden wealth and corruption must have felt like a deep betrayal of the original prophetic message.
Extreme asceticism felt like the only logical, righteous response to a society that had lost its soul.
So the Christian monastic template, which was highly visible in the Levant, became incredibly appealing to them.
Exactly. They adopted the Christian aesthetic of suffering because it visually communicated their rejection of the corrupt Islamic state.
The text also touches heavily on the emotional vocabulary this transition required. It discusses the concept of divine love, addressing God not just as a creator or a master, but with the passionate, almost romantic, agonizing language of a lover speaking to an unattainable beloved.
And the text explicitly links this shift in tone to Christian mysticism, specifically referencing St. Bernard and his 3 stages of salvation.
Let's break those stages down.
Sure. St. Bernard charted a very specific emotional journey. It begins with deep self-reflection, leading to a state of absolute certainty, or witnessing which the text parallels to the Islamic concept of shahada, and finally culminating in a spiritual trance where the self is completely annihilated in the presence of the divine.
And the author views this Christian trajectory of agonizing love leading to self-destruction as the exact blueprint for the Sufi journey toward fana, the annihilation of the ego.
That's the argument, yes.
So if the Middle East provided the physical technology of trance and the emotional aesthetic of suffering, the text argues that the journey doesn't stop there. We move from the somewhat unstructured suffering of the desert monks to an incredibly systematized ancient regime of bodily control. We travel further east to the Indian subcontinent.
Right, where the Christian concept of physical deprivation meets an incredibly systematized regime of mental and physical discipline. The Islamic world's encounter with India was facilitated by early, robust trade routes, both maritime and overland.
But the text places a heavy emphasis on the role of wandering Indian ascetics, right?
Yes, yogis and holy men who physically traveled through Iraq and the Islamic heartlands, bringing their mystical technologies with them.
The author meticulously breaks down the specific Indian influences. They start with Brahmanism, pointing out its intense focus on deep meditation designed to achieve hulu.
Which is the radical concept of the divine actually incarnating or descending into the human form.
Right. Then the text pivots to Buddhism, drawing a direct, functional parallel between the Buddhist ultimate goal of nirvana, the blowing out of the self, and the Sufi concept of absolute fana.
The complete annihilation of the individual identity. Crucially, the text introduces yoga here. But the author doesn't describe yoga as the gentle, flexibility-focused stretching ubiquitous in modern gyms.
Definitely not.
The text frames ancient yoga as a rigorous, almost violent tool for torturing the body in order to completely kill earthly desires. Furthermore, the text heavily highlights the yogic practice of using mantras.
The rhythmic, unceasing repetition of specific words or syllables, and the author explicitly links that use of Indian mantras to the Sufi practice of dhikr.
Because it is the exact same mechanism of using repetitive sound to exhaust the conscious mind and alter reality.
The text even introduces the 19th century figure of Ramakrishna to demonstrate how deep and enduring these Indian mystical roots are, arguing that the core methodology of self-annihilation hasn't changed in millennia.
It's a through line of extreme discipline.
But the section of the text that absolutely stops you in your tracks is the discussion of an ancient Indian book called Patanjali.
Oh, this part is wild.
The author spends significant time outlining the 8 supernatural abilities supposedly granted by extreme asceticism. And when I read this list, my modern brain immediately thinks of comic book superheroes.
Let's list them out for the listener because it's quite a set of powers.
Okay, here we go. Number 1, invisibility or shrinking. Number 2, extreme lightness to the point of walking on water or mud. Number 3, giant size. Number 4, collapsing distance, basically teleporting across the world instantly. Number 5, absolute willpower. Number 6, instantly acquiring any desired knowledge. Number 7, supernatural leadership. And number 8, absolute unquestioning obedience from followers.
The historical reality the author is trying to convey is that in the 8th and 9th centuries, these were not considered fictional superpowers. They were believed to be the guaranteed biological results of extreme physical self-torture.
So what does this all mean? How does the author jump from an Indian yogi claiming he can shrink in a cave to a Muslim Sufi saint performing a miracle? That feels like a massive theological leap.
It is a massive leap.
Because in Orthodox Islam, a miracle, a mujiza or a karama, is a sudden, unearned act of God's grace. It is God breaking the laws of physics to prove a point.
But the text argues that Sufism imported the Indian conceptual framework that supernatural powers are not sudden acts of God's grace, but rather a hard-earned human skill.
Oh, so you can train for it?
Exactly. The author claims that by adopting yogic asceticism, Sufis internalize the belief that if you starve yourself enough and meditate long enough, you can force the universe to bend to your will. It shifts the locus of power entirely from the creator to the practitioner.
Let's look closely at that 8th power from the Patanjali list. Absolute unquestioning obedience from followers. That one really stands out from the rest. Walking on water is a magic trick, but demanding absolute obedience is a psychological weapon.
And the author isolates that 8th power because it perfectly mirrors the deeply controversial dynamic at the heart of Sufi orders, the relationship between the sheikh, the master, and the murid, the disciple.
Right. In many Sufi traditions, the explicit instruction is that a disciple must be in the hands of their sheikh, like a dead body in the hands of the washer.
Absolute, unthinking surrender.
The text is analyzing how this specific brand of human submission, a hallmark of Eastern mysticism, was imported wholesale, creating a rigid system of control that the author believes violently contradicts the Islamic ideal of submitting only to God.
It's a profound structural shift in how faith is practiced.
We've covered the trance technology of the Middle East and the systematized biological weaponization of India. Now, the text shifts our focus from the extreme, superpower-chasing mysticism of the yogis to a philosophy that is quiet, highly structured, and profoundly passive. we arrive in ancient China.
The text introduces the 7th century BC philosopher Laozi, noting his historical context as a contemporary of Confucius.
And their approaches were completely opposite, weren't they?
Entirely. While Confucius dedicated his life to establishing rigid social order and civic duty, the text highlights Laozi's complete retreat from society, escaping to the mountains to write the foundational text of Taoism, the Tao Te.
The author breaks down two massive concepts here to build their case. First, the Tao, which the text defines as the eternal flowing order of the universe, the ultimate spiritual path.
And second, Te, which it translates into the Islamic concept of divine grace or kindness.
The text explains that Laozi believed that to connect with this eternal Tao, a human being must aggressively abandon physical desires, kill the ego, and escape what he viewed as the suffocating material trap of the physical body.
The author's structural argument here is incredibly specific. The text details a rigid, three-step Chinese process for reaching the Tao and lays it directly over the stages of the Sufi path.
Step one in the Chinese model is the purification of the soul, clearing away all earthly desire.
And the author parallels this exactly to the initial Sufi stage of Tazkiyah, the arduous process of purifying the self.
Step two is illumination, the moment the internal work causes the spiritual light to break through the consciousness.
The text links this directly to the Sufi concept of Ishraq or Kashf, the sudden unveiling of hidden divine truths.
And finally, step three is union, completely merging your consciousness with the Tao.
Which the author aligns perfectly with the ultimate Sufi goals of Ittihad, meaning union, and Fana, the total annihilation of the individual self into the divine presence.
Wait a minute, I need to pause this here and really push back on the author's logic.
Go for it.
I can buy the trade routes with India in the Middle Ages. We know Muslims and Hindus were trading spices and ideas. The geographical proximity makes historical sense. But how on earth does the author argue that a 7th century BC Chinese philosophy somehow materially reached early Middle Eastern Sufis? Is the text literally claiming that an early ascetic in Baghdad was reading a translated bamboo scroll of Laozi? Or is this just convergent evolution?
That tension between direct transmission and convergent evolution is the most intellectually demanding part of analyzing a text like this.
It just seems like a stretch.
Well, the author's primary goal is to prove that Sufism is a Frankenstein's monster of foreign imports. They want to show a direct chain of custody for these ideas to invalidate their Islamic authenticity. However, the evidence they present regarding China forces us to confront a much larger psychological question. The text doesn't provide a historical shipping manifest showing the Tao Te Ching arriving in Damascus.
Right. There is no smoking gun of translation like there is with Greek texts later on.
Exactly. While there was undoubtedly indirect contact via the extremities of the Silk Road, the striking identicality of the three stages, purification, illumination, union, might inadvertently highlight a profound universal human truth, rather than a literal transmission of paper.
So you're saying that if you take a human brain, regardless of whether it is sitting in an ancient Chinese bamboo forest, a cave in the Himalayas, or a desert in the Levant, and you task that brain with finding a way to connect with the divine, it always builds the exact same staircase.
That is the implication that the author's evidence accidentally supports. If you want to reach a higher state of consciousness, the biological and psychological reality of being human dictates that you only have a few tools at your disposal.
You have to clean the mental house, which is purification.
You have to alter your perception to see things differently, which is illumination.
And you ultimately desire the comfort of merging with something larger than yourself, which is union.
The author is attempting to prove a vast historical plagiarism, but they may actually be proving the existence of a universal architecture of human spiritual psychology.
The idea that we are all hardwired to hallucinate God in the exact same 3 steps is staggering. But let's follow the author's map away from the East and head back west. Because having all these physical practices, starving yourself, chanting, seeking illumination, is dangerous if you can't explain why you are doing them to the religious authorities.
It leaves you wide open to accusations of heresy.
Exactly. The text argues we have to return to the Mediterranean to explore the final and perhaps most crucial influence, Greek heritage. The author proposes that Greek philosophy became the intellectual operating system that allowed all these bizarre, diverse practices to be formalized into a unified, defensible theology.
The author sets the historical stage centuries earlier with the conquests of Alexander the Great, who violently mixed Greek culture with the intellectual traditions of the East.
And once again, the text drops a fascinating etymological theory. suggesting that the word Sufi might not originate from the Arabic word for wool at all, but is actually a direct corruption of the Greek word Sophia, meaning wisdom.
Philosophy, the love of wisdom. The text dives deeply into a specific school of thought called Neoplatonism. For our listeners who might not have a background in ancient philosophy, Neoplatonism is the system built on Plato's original ideas, but heavily spiritualized and expanded centuries later by thinkers like Plotinus.
And the author zeroes in on their massive theory of divine emanation, or faïs.
Emanation is a complex concept, but it is vital to understanding the author's critique. Imagine a wildly overflowing fountain or a sun emitting endless rays of light.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
In Neoplatonism, the universe was not constructed out of nothing by a builder god who stands apart from his creation. Instead, the universe naturally and eternally flowed out from the one or the first intellect.
This divine energy cascaded downward into the universal soul.
And finally pooled at the bottom to create the dense material world. The author states unequivocally that this specific Greek concept heavily, almost entirely, influenced massive later Sufi philosophers like Ibn Arabi.
The theological implications of that are earth-shattering for an Orthodox Muslim, because if everything is just an emanation flowing from the one, then everything essentially is the one, just existing at different distances from the source. The tree, the rock, the human being, it is all just divine light at different densities.
That Greek idea leads directly into the most controversial Sufi concept of all, Wadat al-Wujud, the absolute unity of being.
The text then pairs this with the Greek concept of Gnosticism. The word derives from the Greek term for knowledge, but the author clarifies it is a highly specific, elitist kind of knowledge.
The text defines Gnosticism as the belief that ultimate higher truths can only be attained through spiritual tasting, or that direct personal unveiling we mentioned earlier, Kash.
It is a deliberate, arrogant rejection of logical, rational proof, and a rejection of standard textual interpretation in favor of direct, unmediated mystical experience.
The author doesn't just leave these as abstract concepts, they bring in some heavy hitters to prove the transmission. They highlight the ideas of a figure known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, a Christian theologian who is completely steeped in Greek Neoplatonism.
The text meticulously unpacks his concept of deification. Dionysius argued that by violently purifying the heart of all material filth, a human could reach a state of ultimate silence, resulting in a literal witnessing of the divine, and eventually becoming godlike.
And to prove that this wasn't just abstract philosophy floating in the ether, the text provides a literal historical transmission mechanism. The author points to Stephen Bar Sudaili, a Syriac Gnostic monk.
His deeply Neoplatonic, highly mystical works were translated and circulated heavily in the Middle East during the exact centuries when Islamic Sufism was organizing itself.
The ideas were literally in the water supply.
Okay, let's unpack this and synthesize all of it, because the structure the author has built is brilliant. If we look at the entire map, Indian yoga provided the brutal physical hardware of starving and torturing the body. Jewish mysticism provided the hardware of trance induction in dark rooms. Christian asceticism provided the aesthetic hardware of poverty and the emotional language of love.
But a man starving himself in a dark room speaking romantically to God looks like a madman, or worse, a heretic.
Right. The author is arguing that Greek philosophy provided the software. It gave these mystics the incredibly complex, high-minded philosophical vocabulary needed to make these bizarre physical practices intellectually legitimate. Is that what the author is getting at?
Yes, and the protection that Greek vocabulary offered cannot be overstated. If an ascetic is simply starving himself in a cave, the Orthodox Islamic scholars, the ulama, would look at him, declare him in violation of the Prophet's sunnah, and order him back to the city to work and pray normally.
But if that exact same man emerges from the cave and explains his starvation using complex Greek philosophical terms like divine emanation, the universal soul, and Gnostic deification, suddenly he isn't a starving madman anymore. He is a sophisticated intellectual theologian.
The Greek vocabulary acted as a shield. It legitimized the movement. It gave them a robust defense against the orthodoxy.
It allowed Sufism to evolve from a disparate, highly suspicious collection of extreme ascetic practices into a formidable, highly systematized intellectual tradition.
Armed with Neoplatonism, Sufi masters could now stand toe-to-toe and debate the greatest, most conservative theologians of the Islamic Empire on their own intellectual turf. The author's ultimate tragedy is that the Orthodox scholars allowed the Trojan horse inside the city walls because it was painted with sophisticated Greek philosophy.
What a sprawling, incredible journey this text has taken us on. Let's briefly recap the magnitude of the author's overarching thesis.
The author is basically arguing that Sufism is a massive, historical melting pot.
The text asserts it is not an original organic Islamic phenomenon, but rather a complex, deeply synthetic movement. It was built by deliberately blending the sensory deprivation of Jewish mystical centers, the isolated aesthetic of Christian desert monks, the superpower-chasing physical regimens of Indian yogis, the three-stage psychological path of Chinese sages, and finally, armored with the complex intellectual software of Greek Neoplatonism.
As we close this deep dive, it is vital to reiterate our ground rules. Today was an exploration of this specific author's historical and theological arguments. The author's clear, undeniable intent is to critique Sufism, framing it as a tragic deviation from Orthodox Islam that was fatally corrupted by foreign influences.
Our goal was not to validate that theological critique, nor to invalidate it. Our purpose was to provide you a window into how the origins of religious movements are fiercely debated, and how history is aggressively mapped by those trying to protect the perceived purity of a specific tradition.
You might be wondering why you, the listener, should care about a centuries-old theological debate over who influenced whom in the medieval Middle East.
You should care because this text, regardless of its theological bias, offers a masterclass in how ideas simply do not respect borders. It shows how human civilization is an endless, messy, utterly fascinating exchange of concepts.
Whether transmitted through maritime trade routes, translated Syriac scrolls, or wandering ascetics sharing stories by a fire, the human desire to understand the divine has driven cross-cultural exchange for millennia. It's the ultimate engine of globalization.
It reveals a reality that theology is almost rarely formed in a vacuum of pure isolation. It is perpetually in a dialogue, and sometimes a vicious battle, with the ideas that surround it.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought. Something the text inadvertently points to, but deliberately avoids answering.
Think about the massive global map we just unrolled. If all these completely isolated civilizations, from the bamboo forests of ancient China and the caves of the Indian subcontinent, to the ascetic deserts of the Levant and the philosophical academies of the Greek Mediterranean, if all of them independently developed almost identical methods of physical deprivation and charted the exact same three stages of spiritual enlightenment, what does that actually mean?
It forces us to ask the ultimate question about the nature of human consciousness.
Does it prove, as the author passionately argues, that these traditions merely copied one another in a grand, millennia-long game of historical telephone? Or does it suggest something deeper and far more mysterious?
Does it suggest a hidden, universal, mystical blueprint hardwired into the very biology of the human brain?
Are we all, regardless of our culture or our era, simply tapping into the exact same hidden spring beneath the river? Something for you to mull over. Have you ever wondered how a simple idea, like something built on purely good, grounded intentions, can just mutate over centuries?
Yeah, like completely warp into something else.
Exactly, into this bizarre phenomenon where, literal madness is worshipped as holiness. Today, we're opening up a highly critical historical text that maps out exactly how that happens.
Right, it's essentially the ultimate historical case study of a movement evolving, or spiraling completely out of control, honestly.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to trace the chronological life cycle of this massive historical and spiritual movement, which is Sufism.
And we have this really detailed theological and historical source text in front of us.
Yeah, and we are going to use it to explore how this movement originated. We'll walk through what the author identifies as the 6 stages of its evolution.
Which is basically a 10th-century transformation from a simple practice of balanced asceticism into this highly complex, institutionalized, and sometimes, frankly, extortionary system.
And we're examining this through a very specific critical lens from our source material. Like, this isn't some romanticized, mystical overview that you'd find in, a poetry anthology.
No, not at all. The text gives us this step-by-step historical breakdown of structural decay.
Right.
We're going to track how human psychology, the dynamics of social power, and the slow integration of foreign philosophies fundamentally reshaped a belief system over 1,000 years. It really functions as a masterclass in how human ideologies mutate.
And we are going to keep connecting this history back to you, the listener. Because understanding how an ideological movement shifts from its roots to extreme, unrecognizable interpretations, that's a pattern you can still see everywhere today.
Oh, absolutely. The 10th century might feel like ancient history, but human behavior hasn't changed at all.
Not one bit. Whether you're looking at modern political echo chambers or extreme tech startup cultures or wellness movements that start with like yoga and end up as high-control
The
groups.
psychological roadmap is exactly the same.
It really is.
It's all about the vulnerability of original intent. When you introduce the passage of time, the charismatic influence of new leaders, and that innate human desire for deeper, more exclusive experiences, the original boundaries of any system are going to be tested.
Right. And our source text argues that in this specific historical case, those boundaries weren't just tested. They were, systematically dismantled and replaced.
Completely replaced.
I think the most surprising thing the text drops right out of the gate is this point about branding.
Oh, the naming thing.
Yeah. The term Sufism, or being a Sufi, did not even exist during the foundational years of the religion. It wasn't around during the time of the Prophet, it wasn't used by his companions, and it wasn't even a concept in the era immediately following them.
Right. The author makes it a major point to emphasize this historical absence. The early generations of devoted Muslims absolutely did not use this label.
So what did they call themselves?
Well, the historical record we're examining notes that these individuals were known strictly by descriptive terms, words that highlighted their actions, not a separate identity.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were referred to as ascetics or zuhad. They were known as worshippers, the nusak, or they were sometimes called the weepers, the bakin.
The weepers. Wow, that's intense.
It is, because these were people who, out of a profound awe and a very tangible fear of the afterlife, would isolate themselves. They might retreat to caves or spend their nights focused entirely on worship.
But crucially, there was no distinct ism.
Exactly. There was no branded, walled-off identity. They were simply orthodox practitioners who were turning the dial of devotion up to a 10.
Right, and the text points out that the actual term Sufi only appeared much later, in the late 2nd Hijri century.
Which is roughly the late 700s CE, for context.
Yeah, so a century or two after the movement's beginnings. That is when the label started getting attached to specific prominent figures like Abu Hashim al-Sufi
Right.
and Jabir bin Hayyan. I was trying to think of how to conceptualize this, and it feels a lot like a neighborhood watch group.
Oh, how so?
Well, as long as they are just neighbors looking out for each other, they're just an active part of the broader community. But the second they print official badges, call themselves the Sentinels, and write their own exclusive manifesto, they have separated themselves.
That makes total sense.
They now have an us versus them identity to defend.
That is an excellent framework for understanding this shift. The adoption of a name is never just about vocabulary, It's a critical psychological threshold.
Right, because you're drawing a line.
Exactly. The moment these intensely devoted worshippers started being called Sufis, a distinct subculture was born. When you belong to the main group, you're bound by the main group's rules.
But when you adopt a unique label,
You create a requirement for a unique philosophy to justify your separation. You have to explain why you are a sentinel and not just a neighbor.
I see.
And that exact search for a defining philosophy made the group highly susceptible to outside influences. They were actively looking for a conceptual framework to fill the new container they had just built.
Which brings in a really fascinating theory from the famous polymath and historian al-Biruni. Our source leans heavily on his observations here.
Yeah, al-Biruni is a key figure in this text.
He was a scholar who actually spent years living in India, right?
Yeah,
Deeply studying cross-cultural exchanges and philosophies.
he did, yes.
And he suggested that the origin of this new movement, and specifically its underlying mysticism, might be tied directly to Hindu ascetic practices.
Right, which is a massive claim.
The text also notes other historians who argue the word Sufi itself derives from the Greek word Sophia, meaning wisdom.
Yeah, so the author is aggressively asserting that this wasn't an organic Islamic development, but an imported foreign idea grafted onto the society.
How does that even happen, though? How do you just import a whole philosophy?
Well, we have to look at the geopolitical reality of the era to understand how that grafting happened. During this period, the Islamic Empire was experiencing massive expansion.
Right, the Golden Age stuff.
Exactly. This is the era of the great translation movements in places like Baghdad, where Greek philosophical texts were being aggressively translated into Arabic.
Yeah.
And trade routes were bringing deep, sustained contact with Indian spiritual traditions. Philosophical osmosis is just inevitable in that environment.
That makes a lot of sense.
Al-Biruni's theory, which the text supports, is that as these early ascetics were looking for ways to deepen their new, separate identity, they began adopting the metaphysical concepts they were suddenly surrounded by.
Like the Greek ideas of cosmic wisdom.
Right, or the Hindu concepts of entirely transcending the physical body. It provided the perfect intellectual architecture for a group that wanted to elevate themselves above standard orthodox worship.
So, by naming themselves, they inadvertently boxed themselves into needing an esoteric philosophy. And they just happened to be living in the intellectual melting pot of the medieval world where those philosophies were suddenly available.
You nailed it. It was the perfect storm.
That makes total sense. And our source argues that this initial shift in identity was the preamble to everything that followed. To truly map out how a community of humble worshipers morphed into something unrecognizable, the text breaks history down into 6 distinct stages.
Yes, the 6 stages are crucial here.
Stage 1 takes place in the 1st to early 2nd century. The also calls this era transcendence from material life. What's the deal with Stage 1?
What is paramount to understand about Stage 1 is that its defining characteristic was strict, uncompromising balance.
Balance.
Yes, the text goes out of its way to show that early asceticism was an attempt to find an equilibrium between the spiritual demands of the soul and the physical realities of human life.
So they weren't just starving themselves in the desert.
Exactly. It was not a rejection of the material world. It was a disciplined refusal to be consumed by it. To highlight this, the text cites a foundational rule laid down by the prophet.
What was the rule?
It goes, your body has a right over you, your eyes have a right over you, your spouse has a right over you.
I was really struck by a specific story the text includes to illustrate that balance in action. It describes an incident inside the mosque where a rope had been tied between 2 pillars.
Oh, the rope story. I love this one.
It's so vivid. The prophet asked what the rope was for, and he was told that a woman had tied it there so that when she became physically exhausted from standing in long voluntary prayers, she could grip the rope to keep herself from collapsing.
Right.
And the prophet immediately ordered the rope to be taken down. His instruction was remarkably pragmatic. He said, you should pray while you have the natural energy and focus, and when you become tired, you should sit down.
That anecdote is vital because it perfectly encapsulates the rationality of Stage 1 faith.
It's super practical.
It really is. There was zero tolerance for extreme self-mortification or, pushing the human body beyond its natural healthy limits in the pursuit of spiritual clout.
Right. No suffering just for the sake of suffering.
The physical body wasn't viewed as a prison to be destroyed. It was a vessel with inherent rights that had to be respected. The goal of early asceticism was intense devotion, absolutely, but it was a devotion that had to remain sustainable.
Sustainable and rational within the framework of normal human obligations. It was grounded in objective reality.
Exactly. Objective reality.
But as we know, history doesn't stay grounded for long. The text moves us right into Stage 2, which spans the late 2nd to the 3rd century.
Yes, the shift begins.
The author labels this era imitating predecessors, but he points out a massive foundational shift in how devotion is actually experienced.
Right, the attention moves away from the external balance we just talked about and plunges heavily inward.
This is the era that introduces figures like Ibrahim bin Adam, and most crucially, a woman named Rabia al-Adawiyya.
Rabia is such a key figure here.
And the text identifies Rabia as the person who introduces a concept that completely alters the trajectory of the movement, divine love.
This is a monumental pivot point in the theology. Up until this era, the text indicates that the primary psychological drivers of asceticism were a profound fear of the afterlife and an intense desire for salvation.
Which makes sense. We can call that transactional faith.
Yes, transactional. It is objective, it is consequence-based, and it relies heavily on following the rules.
But Rabia completely upends that framework. She famously proclaimed that she did not worship God out of a fear of hell, nor did she worship out of a desire for heaven.
Right, which was a radical thing to say.
Super radical. Her claim was that she worshiped purely, solely out of love. The text includes her incredibly famous quote, "I have made you my conversational partner in my heart."
It's beautiful poetry.
I have to admit, when you first read reviews of poetry, it is undeniably beautiful. The idea of pure, unadulterated love without any transactional motive, doing something just for the sake of love, not for a reward, is incredibly appealing to the human spirit. But as I read deeper into our source text, it became clear the author views this not as a beautiful awakening, but as a deeply dangerous turning point.
Oh, he's very critical of it.
If you remove the practical, objective rules of balance from Stage 1, like the take down the rope rule, and you replace it with an overwhelming, all-consuming focus on love, you are fundamentally changing the metric of success.
You've put your finger on the exact mechanism of the shift. What the author is critiquing here is the psychological transition from an objective communal practice to a highly subjective individual experience.
Right, because love is entirely internal.
Exactly. While the text doesn't deny the sincere devotion of these stage 2 figures, it highlights that relying purely on internal emotional states is an inherently unstable way to build a community.
It's too fluid.
Think about the difference between transactional and experiential faith. Transactional faith relies on shared laws. Did you pray? Did you fast? Did you treat your neighbor well? Those are measurable actions.
Anyone can see if you're doing them.
Right. Experiential faith relies on feelings. How intense is your love? How deep is your longing?
And you can't measure that.
No. If the only valid metric for spiritual success becomes the intensity of your internal state, the external orthodox boundaries of practice quickly start to feel inadequate.
They start to feel like a drag. If you are experiencing this soaring, ecstatic, personal, emotional, high-standard religious laws, which are rigid, practical, and apply to everyone equally, from the highest scholar to the poorest farmer, suddenly look mundane.
Exactly. You begin replacing a shared communal reality with a highly subjective individual reality.
And when subjective emotion becomes the ultimate authority, standard rules lose their authority.
They absolutely do.
And this is exactly where I want you, the listener, to lean in, because this psychological trap is everywhere today. Think about modern movements that prioritize pure internal feeling over external reality or concrete action.
Like in corporate settings.
Yes. Or toxic wellness cults, or high-demand corporate cultures. When the only thing that matters is how passionate you are, or how perfectly aligned your vibes are with the mission, the people who display the most extreme dramatic passion start getting all the authority.
Wow, that's so true.
Objective reality is thrown out the window in favor of who can perform the most intense emotion. And that blurring of boundaries is precisely what bridges us into the text's next historical phases, where things take a sharp, terrifying turn into the abstract.
That brings us right to stage 3, which our historical text places in the 3rd to mid-4th century. The author defines this stage by the introduction of ambiguous terms.
Ambiguous terms, like changing the vocabulary.
The very vocabulary of the movement changes drastically. The followers stop using the straightforward language of early theology and start using terminology that is esoteric, highly symbolic, and intentionally confusing to the general public.
Intentionally confusing. That is a classic hallmark of a group isolating itself from mainstream scrutiny.
It's Cult Behavior 101. The major figure the text highlights in this era is a man named Abu Yazid al-Bistami.
Right.
He introduces a philosophical concept called fauna, which translates directly to annihilation.
Annihilation. That sounds intense.
It is. And we are not talking about physical death here. This is total psychological and spiritual erasure. Al-Bistami claimed that the true knower, the spiritually elite person, has no individual state left.
So they just stop being themselves.
Exactly. Their ego, their consciousness, their very identity is completely erased and entirely absorbed into the identity of the divine.
Philosophically, this is a massive, incredibly dangerous leap from where we started.
It's a totally different universe.
Connect this back to the early stage 1 ascetics, who were actively trying to balance their worldly duties to their bodies and families with their prayers. Fauna is operating in a completely different reality.
Right, because if your identity is completely annihilated, who is the one praying?
Exactly. Who is the one fulfilling the rights of the spouse or the body? Who is the one bound by morality?
No one. This concept of annihilation sets the intellectual groundwork for total lawlessness. Because if you truly believe, or, convince others, that you have no self left, then the standard rules meant to govern human behavior no longer seem to apply to you.
You've essentially hacked the system.
You've created the ultimate loophole.
So you have a theological system that has entirely abandoned objective religious rules and is running on pure, subjective emotional frenzy. That level of philosophical abstraction inevitably demands a breaking point.
It has to break.
And that brings us right into stage 4. We are now in the 4th century, and our source text explicitly labels this as the most dangerous phase yet, liberation from religious obligations.
Yeah, the rules are officially gone.
This is where the intellectual loophole of fauna, created in stage 3, gets actively exploited for power. The text points its heaviest artillery at a figure named Al-Hallaj.
Oh, Al-Hallaj. The source material pulls absolutely no punches with him.
None. It fiercely critiques him not just as a misguided philosopher, but as an outright trickster and a dangerous illusionist.
The author paints a very detailed picture of how Al-Hallaj operated. He describes him as someone who weaponized the concept of fauna to build a cult of personality.
He used chemistry, right?
Yes. The text alleges that he utilized his knowledge of chemistry, combined with basic sleight of hand and psychological manipulation, to fake miracles.
That's so wild.
He preyed on the vulnerability of followers who had already been primed by the previous century of teachings to expect the impossible and to distrust their own rational minds.
The specific con described in the text is wild, and I want to really unpack how it worked. The text says Al-Hallaj would secretly bury reserves of food and water in the ground at highly specific locations along a desolate road.
Just stashing it for later.
Right. Later, he would arrange to be walking down that exact road accompanied by a disciple. Eventually, the disciple would become exhausted and complain of severe hunger or thirst.
Which he knew was going to happen.
Of course. Al-Hallaj would then play the part of the divine conduit. He would feign having a miraculous revelation, point to the ground, and instruct the disciple to dig in that exact spot.
Yeah.
And miraculously, there is a hidden feast.
It is the absolute classic playbook of a charlatan, but it's being applied within a highly charged theological setting.
Right.
What is critical for us to analyze here is how the previous historical stages made this deception possible. Why did this work?
Because I am struggling with this. Let's look at the psychology of the disciple digging up the food. If I am walking down a dirt road with a guy, and he points to a random patch of dirt, and I dig up a perfectly preserved loaf of bread and a jug of water,
Yeah.
my immediate instinctual thought is, you planted this here. Was the average person back then just incredibly gullible? Or is there a deeper psychological manipulation happening here that overrides basic human logic?
It is not about historical gullibility. It is about systematic psychological conditioning.
Okay, unpack that for me.
To understand why the disciple doesn't see the trick, you have to look at the environment. By stage 4, this movement had spent over a century aggressively convincing its followers that human reason, logic, and traditional intellectual inquiry were actually massive obstacles to true enlightenment.
So thinking critically was literally a sin.
They were indoctrinated with the idea that to question the sheikh, or the spiritual leader, using your intellect was a sign of spiritual weakness and arrogance.
Wow.
When a group systematically breaks down your reliance on your own critical thinking and replaces it with an absolute terrifying reliance on the leader's subjective truth, you become profoundly susceptible to manipulation.
Because you've been taught not to trust your own eyes.
Exactly. Add in the fact that these disciples were likely physically exhausted, sleep-deprived from endless chanting, and emotionally desperate. You want to believe the miracle.
The buried food isn't a red flag to you. It's the desperately needed confirmation that you chose the right guide.
You surrender your skepticism because in this system, skepticism has been branded as a sin.
Skepticism has been branded as a sin. That is a terrifying phrase. So you have this mass of followers who have dropped all standard rules, who have been trained for decades to ignore their own logic, and who are desperately looking for miracles from a charismatic leader.
And it led to complete chaos.
The text notes that this resulted in chaotic, frenzied gatherings, where followers abandoned traditional prayer, engaged in ambiguous chants, and literally worked themselves into states where they lost consciousness.
Yeah, totally unmoored from reality.
But human beings can't sustain that level of chaotic, directionless energy forever. Society inevitably craves structure. When people can't find stability in the old rational rules, they will build a new authoritarian system to contain the madness.
That is precisely the transition our source outlines next.
Welcome to stage 5. I call this the corporate era of mysticism.
That's a great way to put it. The author refers to this as the 5th century crystallization of the movement into formal tariqas or Sufi orders. This is the institutionalization of charisma. The wild, unpredictable, individualistic energy of the earlier stages is corralled into massive, highly structured, hierarchical organizations.
Like franchises.
Yes. This is the era of what the text portrays as the definitive megastars of the movement. We see the rise of figures like Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, Ahmad al-Rifai, Abu al-Hassan al-Shahili, and Ahmad al-Badawi.
And the source notes that the followers during this stage began attributing massive, practically cinematic miracles to these men. They call these miracles karamat.
We are not talking about the parlor tricks of finding buried food anymore.
No, the text points out that followers genuinely believed and actively propagated stories that Jazani could walk on air.
Walk on air.
That he could command the jinn, which, for listeners unfamiliar with the theology, are supernatural beings made of smokeless fire. They completely elevated these leaders from just being pious, devoted men into being practically demigods who possessed absolute control over the physical fabric of reality.
And with that elevated superhuman status came intense branding and rigid authoritarian hierarchy.
The branding is wild here.
The text provides a fascinating sociological example with Ahmad al-Badawi in Egypt. Here was a man who, according to our source, refused marriage, isolated himself from normal society, and yet was elevated to the status of a supreme saint.
Right.
More importantly, his followers became a distinct, recognizable political and social faction. They were distinguished by their trademark red turbans.
Red turbans. It became a visual uniform.
They weren't just an ideology anymore, they were a recognizable franchise.
And the text also highlights another leader, Ibrahim al-Dasuki. His specific order demanded absolute, terrifyingly unquestioning submission from the disciple to the sheikh.
This part is chilling.
You didn't just learn theology from the leader, you surrendered your entire free will to him. The famous saying was that a disciple must be like a literal corpse in the hands of the person washing it.
A literal corpse. Complete, unresisting submission.
The text notes that to enforce this stage heavily popularized new, unoriginal litanies, basically branded chants specific to each order that you had to recite thousands of times to prove loyalty.
Like corporate slogans.
Exactly. And it heavily promoted grave worship. The physical tunes of these megastars became centers of massive, institutionalized devotion and financial power.
If we look at the sociology of this transition, it is a brilliant, albeit dark, pivot.
How so?
They went from being isolated ascetics hiding in caves in stage 1, terrified of the afterlife, to building these massive, branded franchises with uniforms, proprietary chants, and a rigid chain of command. Why does an entire population willingly do this?
That's the big question.
It speaks deeply to the human desire for certainty. In the chaotic, unpredictable, often violent medieval world, joining a highly structured order is deeply comforting.
Especially one with a guy who can walk on air.
Especially an order that promises a direct, guaranteed VIP path to divine favor, led by a man who can supposedly command the supernatural forces of the universe. You are willfully trading your intellectual autonomy for psychological security.
Wow.
It is the complete shift from a difficult personal spiritual journey to membership in a rigid social institution.
You trade your autonomy for security. That hits so hard because we see it happen constantly today. People join high-demand groups or extreme political factions because the chaotic reality of the world is just too stressful.
They want someone to just tell them what to do.
They want a strong man who promises them they are part of an elite, protected group. But it brings up a really crucial question. What happens to an institution or a society when its entire foundational structure is built on valuing bizarre, unexplainable supernatural behavior over objective, rational thought?
That's where things get really dark.
If the guy at the top is revered specifically because he supposedly commands jinn and walks on air, what does that do to the behavioral culture of the followers over time?
It creates a culture where rationality is no longer the baseline for acceptable human behavior. In fact, rationality becomes highly suspect.
Okay.
If the divine is utterly irrational, then to be rational is to be disconnected from the divine. And that sociological reality brings us directly to the final and undoubtedly the most chaotic stage outlined in our source text.
Stage 6. The text places this stage in the 9th and 10th centuries, and it calls this the era of the Majadib, which translates roughly to the attracted ones, or, much more bluntly, the divine madmen.
The divine madmen.
This is where the story goes completely fundamentally off the rails. The author is very clinical in breaking down this phase. The text strictly categorizes these divine madmen into 3 distinct groups.
Yes, the source provides a highly logical taxonomy of the madness, which is really interesting.
Walk us through the 3 groups.
The first group, according to the text, were simply opportunistic fakers. These were people pretending to be insane to achieve political or religious motives, or frequently just to escape the law or the heavy taxation and scrutiny of the sultans.
Okay, so just straight-up con artists.
Right. The second group were individuals suffering from severe, permanent psychiatric illnesses, schizophrenia, severe dementia, things of that nature.
Okay.
And the third group were people suffering from temporary psychological breaks, manic episodes, or mental crises.
But the ultimate tragedy and the focal point of the author's blistering critique is not that these people existed. It's how society systematically reacted to all 3 of these groups.
Exactly.
The source provides these astonishing, incredibly specific examples of how literal, dangerous madness was reinterpreted by the general public as supreme holiness. Take the story of Abu al-Khair al-Kulaybani.
Oh, the meat
He
story.
got the name al-Kulaybani, which relates to the Arabic word for dogs, because his standard behavior was to forcefully accost regular people in the market, compel them to buy expensive meat from the butchers, and then he would take that meat and immediately feed it to the stray, wild dogs in the street.
By any modern, rational, or even classical Islamic standard of jurisprudence, this is someone exhibiting highly erratic, unwell behavior. He's forcefully interfering with the public order and wasting resources.
Right.
But in the twisted context of stage 6, he wasn't restrained, and he certainly wasn't offered medical or psychological treatment. He was revered.
It's just so hard to wrap my head around.
His chaotic actions were interpreted as possessing some, and that loss of reality is the tragic, inevitable irony the text is trying to expose. You have to trace the thread back to remember the groundwork that was laid in stages 3 and 4.
The annihilation stuff.
Yes. By stage 6, the movement had spent centuries thoroughly demonizing the intellect. They had relentlessly taught generations of people that standard religious law, basic morality, and common sense were actually barriers to the ultimate truth.
Because if you're thinking logically, you're not surrendering to the sheik.
Precisely.
Oh.
Because of that sustained ideological conditioning, society literally lacked the intellectual vocabulary to call out mental illness or outright criminal fraud.
Wow.
When you have been taught since birth that the highest spiritual state is the annihilation of the self, and that standard rules do not apply to the holy elite, then extreme irrationality doesn't look like madness.
It looks like the ultimate proof of holiness.
It looks like someone who has successfully transcended the mundane physical world.
So why are we spending an hour talking about the 10th century? What does this mean for you, the person listening to this right now? Because it is really easy to look back at history with a sense of superiority and laugh at medieval people giving free food to a screaming, extortionist man in a market.
It is easy, but it's a mistake.
But I want you to think about the extreme echo chambers we live in today. Think about highly insular political factions. Think about the cult-like worship of eccentric tech billionaires.
Oh, the parallels are striking.
Think about niche, radical internet communities. When a group collectively decides that the insiders possess a secret elevated truth that the outsiders are just too blind or brainwashed to understand, the rules of basic logic go completely out the window.
Completely.
Any bizarre, toxic, or erratic behavior by the leadership isn't called out as crazy. It gets actively justified by the followers. People say, oh, he's just playing 4D chess, or she's operating on a higher plane. You just don't see the long-term vision.
Yep.
When a community loses the vocabulary of basic, objective rationality, extortion truly does look like enlightenment.
It is a textbook historical example of how the Overton window of acceptable behavior aggressively shifts within a closed ideological system. Once the foundational premise is accepted that the leader, or the enlightened class, is beyond normal objective constraints, there is theoretically no limit to what abuses can be justified.
The sky's the limit.
The author uses these extreme examples of the Majahib, the divine madman, to prove a massive systemic point. The ideology itself, by deliberately stripping away the objective practical balance of stage 1, inevitably created a society that structurally rewarded pathology. It was a feature of the system, not a bug.
Okay, let's take a breath and zoom out to look at the massive historical journey we just took. We've traveled through the source text chronological map of the 6 stages of this movement.
It's been quite a ride.
We started in stage 1 with the community of early ascetics who were just trying to maintain a healthy, rational balance between the spiritual and the physical. Remember the foundational pragmatism, the prophet removing the rope in the mosque, telling people to rest when they were tired.
The era of grounded balance.
Then we moved to stage 2, the shift inward, where Rabia al-Adawiya's intense focus on overwhelming, all-consuming divine love began to slowly prioritize subjective emotion over shared structure.
Which led logically and directly into stage 3 and 4. The eras of annihilation and the total dropping of religious laws.
Right.
This is where figures like al-Bastami and the illusionist al-Hallaj convinced their exhausted followers that physical rules no longer applied to the spiritually elite, using concepts like fana to enforce compliance and punish skepticism.
And this massive rejection of the rules created a terrifying vacuum of structure, which was eagerly filled in stage 5 by the massive, branded, rigid institutions.
The corporate era.
This is the rise of the Sufi orders, the tariqas with their red turbans, unoriginal chants, and absolute demands for a disciple to be a literal corpse in the hands of the sheikh.
And finally, that centuries-long rejection of objective rationality culminated in stage 6, the societal elevation of the divine madman.
A society where public extortion, harassment of street vendors, and severe untreated mental illness were not just tolerated, but celebrated as the absolute highest forms of spiritual connection. It is an incredible, almost terrifying trajectory of human behavior.
And it serves as an incredibly powerful analytical tool for us today. This deep dive isn't just about parsing historical theology from a specific medieval text.
Yeah.
It is a masterclass in understanding the life cycle of an ideology. It asks you to look critically at the movements, the philosophies, or even the intense corporate cultures you might be a part of today.
It really forces the question.
How easily can the original balanced intent of any group be warped and weaponized by charismatic leaders over time if objective rules are abandoned in favor of pure subjective experiences?
Exactly. And that brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today. Something for you to mull over on your commute or while you're at the gym or doing the dishes. Our source text pointed out right at the very beginning that the actual term Sufi didn't even exist when the early ascetics were practicing their pure, balanced spirituality.
They're just the weepers.
They didn't have a logo, they didn't have a brand name, they didn't have an exclusive manifesto. They were just doing the work. They were just practicing their faith within the broader community. It makes you wonder, is the true, authentic spirit of any movement actually lost the exact moment you try to put a label on it?
That's a great point.
The moment you name it, brand it, separate it from the community, and organize it into a rigid institution? Is that the exact moment the original idea starts to die? Something for you to think about.
Because once you build the walls to protect an idea, you're no longer just experiencing the foundation. You become confined by the structure you've created, and you lose sight of the horizon.
You're stuck inside the institution. And as we learned today, walking through 10 centuries of history, sometimes it's incredibly hard to see that the blueprint has fundamentally changed until you are already living in a completely different building. Until next time, keep diving deep. Usually, when we look at a great piece of architecture, right, say a towering cathedral or a grand historical mosque, we tend to see it as one cohesive vision.
Right, exactly. We project this neat, unbroken lineage onto it.
Yeah. We assume, an architect drew up the plans, a unified crew built it, and it just kind of sprang out of the ground fully formed, expressing this single, pure, philosophical idea.
Which is nice, but it completely ignores the messy reality of how human beings actually build things over centuries.
Exactly. But, okay, imagine you walk into this beautiful ancient building, and you start examining the mortar, peeling back the layers a little bit. Suddenly you realize the foundation is made of salvaged Roman bricks.
Right.
The arches are distinctly Gothic. There's a stained glass window that looks, Byzantine. And the roof tiles seem almost East Asian.
Yeah, it's an architectural Frankenstein.
Exactly. You thought you were looking at a pure, localized style, but what you're actually standing inside is a structure built by 1,000 different hands, utilizing whatever materials happen to be traveling down the trade routes at the time.
That's a perfect analogy for what we're looking at today.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are acting as historical detectives, and we've got a fascinating, incredibly dense case file tailored just for your curious mind.
We really do. So the source material we are examining today is a highly analytical text. It dives deep into the historical, theological, and even psychological roots of Sufism.
Which is broadly understood as Islamic mysticism.
Right. And the specific mission for this deep dive is to isolate and unpack a sweeping historical argument from the text. The author's central claim is that early Sufi practices, beliefs, and even their specialized vocabulary did not develop in a vacuum.
Not at all.
Instead, early Sufism operated like this massive syncretic sponge.
Like a cultural vacuum cleaner.
Exactly.
The argument is that it absorbed concepts, ascetic rituals, and entire philosophical frameworks from almost every major world religion and ancient tradition it brushed up against,
Right.
During the explosive expansion of the early Islamic Empire.
And we are talking about a massive geographical journey here.
Oh, huge. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going from ancient Jewish dark rooms and Christian monastic deserts in the Levant, all the way to Indian trade routes, ancient Chinese sages, and the lecture halls of Greek philosophers.
It's a lot of ground to cover, but before we map out this massive web of ideas, we need to set the parameters for how we are engaging with this material.
Yeah, that is a crucial first step because, the source text we are dissecting carries a very specific highly critical lens.
Right. It frames all of these foreign influences as deviations. The author's perspective is that these borrowed elements are fundamentally at odds with Orthodox Islam, essentially corrupting the original faith.
So we need to make it explicitly clear to you, the listener, that our goal today is not to take sides in that theological debate.
Absolutely not. We are not here to endorse the text critique, nor are we here to defend the origins of Sufism. Our objective is strictly forensic.
We're just mapping out the historical connections, the ideological bridges, and, well, the mechanics of this alleged cultural exchange. We want to understand the how and the why behind the claims our source material is making.
Exactly. So let's start peeling back those architectural layers.
Right. And the most logical place to begin, both geographically and chronologically for the early Islamic Empire, is with its closest ideological neighbors, the Abrahamic echoes.
Makes sense. Because when the early Islamic Empire expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th and 8th centuries, it didn't just conquer empty sand.
Right, there were people there.
A lot of people. It absorbed vast regions stretching through the Levant, North Africa, and Mesopotamia, regions that were already deeply saturated with centuries of entrenched religious traditions.
And the text argues that this physical proximity inevitably led to ideological cross-pollination.
It does, and one of the foundational arguments it makes is the deep influence of Jewish mysticism on early Islamic ascetics.
Yeah, and the text highlights a very specific physical manifestation of this. It brings up the concept of ancient Jewish mystical centers called masfayat.
Right, located in regions that were newly under Muslim control.
Exactly. And what really stands out in the source is the physical environment of these practices. These mystics were deliberately worshiping and meditating in completely darkened, isolated rooms.
The focus on sensory deprivation is the mechanical link the author is really trying to establish here. I mean, if you look at the mechanics of human psychology, when you remove visual and auditory stimuli by retreating into a lightless cave or a sealed room, the brain naturally turns inward.
It starts making up its own input.
Exactly. It begins to generate its own internal stimuli to compensate for the lack of external input. It's a well-documented technique for inducing altered states of consciousness.
So the argument presented here is that early Muslim populations observed these Jewish ascetics retreating into dark, isolated spaces to achieve, elevated spiritual states, and subsequently adopted the physical practice.
Right. The text links this directly to the early Sufi practice of khalwa.
Khalwa, which is the practice of spiritual retreat and isolation under the guidance of a master.
Exactly.
It's essentially the ancient world's version of a sensory deprivation tank. You shut off the outside world to force the inside world to turn the volume up.
That's a great way to put it. But the influence wasn't just found in total silence and darkness. The text also points to a very loud, highly kinetic overlap.
Right, the mechanics of musical worship. The source draws a direct causal line between ancient Jewish temple practices and the Sufi dhikr.
And for context, dhikr often involves rhythmic, repetitive chanting of God's names, accompanied by swaying, controlled breathing, and sometimes ecstatic dancing.
Right, and the author makes a compelling comparative argument here by pointing straight to the Old Testament.
Yes, the text explicitly cites the Psalms of David to demonstrate that ecstatic, physical, and musical worship was an established Jewish mystical tradition long before it appeared in Islamic contexts.
I think the quote they use is, let me see.
It's from Psalms. Let the children of Zion rejoice in their king. Let them praise his name with dance. Let them sing praises unto him with the timbrel and harp.
Right. So the functional argument here is that if you see two groups in the exact same geographical region practicing a highly specialized form of rhythmic, physical chanting to achieve religious ecstasy.
And one group has been doing it for centuries longer.
Exactly. Then the newer group likely absorbed the mechanics from the older one.
Precisely. The text views the physical practices of dhikr as a mirror reflecting ancient Jewish temple and mystical practices adapted into an Islamic framework.
But the analysis goes far deeper than just adopting a physical ritual. The text outlines a really profound theological pipeline regarding the nature of divine knowledge.
Right. It argues that Jewish mystical concepts regarding prophecy and the ability of the prophet to access hidden, unseen knowledge began to subtly morph as they crossed cultural lines.
And in the Islamic mystical context, the text argues this ancient concept found a new home in the idea of kash.
Yes. Let's unpack the mechanics of kash, because that term is really central to this entire discussion.
Right. Kash translates roughly to unveiling. It's the concept of pulling back the material curtain of reality to perceive the hidden truths of the universe directly.
Without the need for a rational deduction or traditional scholarly learning.
Exactly. Direct access.
And the text's critical assertion here is that Orthodox Islam generally sealed the door on direct divine revelation after the Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, the author argues that the Sufi concept of kashf, the idea that a contemporary mystic can receive direct, unquestionable inspiration or unveiling from the divine, is an adaptation of the Jewish prophetic tradition.
Essentially smuggled into Islamic thought under a different name.
Right.
And the text takes that pipeline theory even further, mapping out what we could call a multi-generational game of ideological telephone. It details an ancient Jewish mystical idea of a divine part or a divine spark.
Right, a spark that could supposedly reincarnate or inhabit chosen, highly elevated human beings.
Yeah, and this is where the ideological bridging becomes highly complex.
Very complex. According to the source, this concept of an indwelling divine spark first influenced the early development of Shiite theology.
Specifically, the reverence for their imams.
Yes, viewing them as infallible and possessing a unique, inherited divine essence that separated them from ordinary believers. And then the text argues that that established framework directly influenced the later Sufi reverence for their sheikhs, or spiritual masters.
Right. It builds a hierarchy where the spiritual master isn't just a knowledgeable teacher, but an almost infallible figure possessing a direct, unquestionable connection to the divine reality. A connection that the disciple just has to completely submit to.
Exactly.
But okay, I have to push back here on the mechanics of this transmission because this touches on the core of how we understand human history. The text is alleging a deliberate, step-by-step pipeline. But if we look at human nature, isn't there a simpler explanation?
Like convergent evolution?
Yeah. I mean, if you put any group of human beings in a room and tell them to seek a profound spiritual experience, they are eventually going to try sensory deprivation. They're going to try rhythmic chanting. And they are naturally going to elevate their most charismatic leaders to near-divine status.
It's a very common human pattern.
It happens in cults. It happens in modern wellness retreats. How does the author actually prove this was a deliberate assimilation like an ancient cultural exchange program, rather than just the convergent evolution of human psychology?
Well, that is the exact friction point of this entire field of study. The source text vehemently rejects the convergent evolution theory in this specific historical context. Its argument relies heavily on the timeline and the geography.
Oh, interesting. How so?
It points out that these practices did not spontaneously erupt in isolated pockets of the Arabian desert prior to the conquests. They emerged specifically in the cosmopolitan centers of Iraq, Syria, and Egypt.
The exact places where large populations of Jewish mystics and scholars already lived.
Precisely. The author is arguing that when you have ideological emergence perfectly mirroring geographical proximity, attributing it to mere coincidence ignores the reality of how human societies interact. People talk. People convert.
They bring their pre-existing psychological architecture into their new belief systems.
Exactly.
It makes perfect sense. If you conquer a city, the people living in that city don't just erase their mental hard drives overnight. They synthesize. Which brings us perfectly to the other major Abrahamic influence the text explores, which is the Christian monastic blueprint.
Right. Because if Jewish mysticism provided the psychological mechanics of sensory deprivation and chanting, Christianity seems to have provided the physical aesthetic and the lifestyle structure.
The visual transformation of the early Muslim ascetic is heavily analyzed in the source material. When the first generations of Muslim ascetics began to appear in the Levantan areas comprising modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, they adopted a look that was not native to the Arabian Peninsula.
Right. They adopted the literal physical appearance of the Christian monks who had been populating those harsh desert regions for centuries.
And the wardrobe was incredibly specific. The text notes they wore rough wool, garments heavily patched together, practiced strict celibacy, and engaged in intense, punishing periods of fasting.
And let's focus on the wool for a second, because historically, clothing is never just clothing. It's a socioeconomic statement.
Absolutely. The early Islamic Empire was rapidly acquiring immense wealth at this time. The ruling classes in Damascus and Baghdad were wearing fine silks, imported linens, and generally displaying their conquests.
Exactly. And the Arabic word for wool is suf, a massive body of linguistic scholarship, which our source text leans on, points to this as the origin of the word Sufi, meaning the ones who wear wool.
So choosing to wear scratchy, uncomfortable, cheap wool in a society obsessed with newly acquired luxury was a highly visible, deliberate rejection of the material world. It was a sartorial protest.
It was, and the text argues that they didn't invent this protest. They mimicked the established poverty of the Christian monks they shared the landscape with. The source even highlights early Muslim figures who were so aligned with this lifestyle that they were literally nicknamed monks.
Right. The most famous example given is Uwais al-Qarni, a revered early ascetic who was widely known as the monk of the Ummah, or the monk of the Muslim community.
Which is a staggering title to hold.
It really is, considering that Orthodox Islam, based on prophetic traditions, explicitly rejects monasticism. The idea of completely withdrawing from society, refusing marriage, and punishing the body is structurally opposed to the classical Islamic model of community engagement.
Right.
So the fact that an early Muslim figure was celebrated as a monk shows just how incredibly porous the cultural boundaries were at that time.
Truly. But the text doesn't just stop at fashion and fasting. It digs into the philosophical engine driving this asceticism. And this is where it introduces St. Bernard of Clairvaux.
St. Bernard is a towering figure in medieval Christian mysticism, and the author uses his theological framework to demonstrate a profound structural overlap.
Right. St. Bernard outlined a highly specific three-stage psychological journey to achieve salvation and divine communion. Let's break down the mechanics of those stages.
Okay, lay it out.
Stage 1 is the contemplation of the self and the material world, recognizing one's own flaws and the inherent emptiness of earthly pursuits. Stage 2 involves reaching a state of absolute certainty, a kind of internal divine witnessing where faith transitions into direct perception.
And then comes stage 3, which is the most radical. The text describes St. Bernard's third stage as achieving absence.
Absence, yes.
This is the psychological state where the individual ego, the sense of I, is completely annihilated, melted away by the overwhelming presence of the divine.
And the author then takes this three-stage Christian framework and overlays it onto the classical Sufi journey. The mapping is nearly one-to-one.
It really is. That vital third stage, the complete annihilation of the individual ego, corresponds flawlessly with the core Sufi doctrine of fana.
Yes, fana is the ultimate goal of the Sufi mystic, to extinguish the self so completely that only God remains. The source text is arguing that the structural mechanics of reaching this state were imported directly from the Christian monastic tradition.
And to ground this in textual evidence, the source introduces a framework developed by Dr. Hassan Asi, who identifies 3 specific pillars where this translation of Christian theology into Islamic mysticism occurred.
What's fascinating here is that he looks at the exact phrasing of gospel verses and shows how they birthed Sufi paradigms. Let's look at the first pillar he identifies, which is the concept of poverty.
Okay. Dr. Asi draws a direct line from the Gospel of Luke to Sufi ideology. He quotes the famous beatitude, "Blessed be ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God."
Right. In early Christianity, voluntary poverty wasn't just a circumstance. It was a spiritual weapon against the ego. Dr. Asi argues that this specific theological elevation of poverty as a prerequisite for holiness was adopted wholesale by the early Sufis.
Who made fare, or poverty, a central tenet of their path, stripping themselves of all possessions to rely solely on the divine.
Which flows perfectly into Dr. Asi's second pillar, reliance, or in Arabic, tawakkul.
Now, tawakkul is a standard Islamic concept, meaning trust in God. But Dr. Asi argues the Sufis took the Christian monastic interpretation of it, pushing it to an absolute behavioral extreme.
He connects this behavioral extreme to the Gospel of Matthew. Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them.
And the source text details how early Sufis operationalized this verse. They didn't just trust God while going to work, they structurally dropped out of the economy. Some extreme ascetics would actively refuse to store even a single day's worth of food, viewing the act of saving provisions as an insult to God's providence. They were living the birds of the air metaphor, literally.
The psychological pressure of living like that must have been immense.
Unimaginable. But it's the third pillar Dr. Asi identifies that I find the most fascinating, because it represents a massive paradigm shift in how the believer actually talks to God. The third pillar is divine love.
This is perhaps the most defining characteristic of later Sufism. Historically, the Orthodox Islamic framework heavily emphasized God as the omnipotent creator, the absolute sovereign, and the ultimate judge.
The relationship was built on awe, obedience, and submission.
Right. But Dr. Assi points out that Christian mysticism had long cultivated a deeply intimate, almost romantic language of the soul seeking union with God. It was the paradigm of the passionate lover desperately seeking the beloved.
You read the poetry of Rumi or Hafiz, and they're constantly talking about the agony of separation from the beloved, the intoxication of divine love, using all these metaphors of wine and romance.
Dr. Assis is arguing that this specific emotional vernacular, the transition from transactional obedience to passionate, consuming love, was the beating heart of Christian monasticism injected directly into the veins of Islamic poetry and theology.
Wow. So to summarize the Abrahamic foundation our text has laid out, we have Judaism providing the mechanical tools of sensory deprivation and rhythmic chanting, along with the framework for elevating the spiritual master.
And we have Christianity providing the physical aesthetic of poverty, the behavioral extreme of reliance, and the intimate, poetic language of divine love.
It's a compelling case for a highly porous ancient world. But the source text doesn't stop at the Mediterranean. If the Abrahamic faiths provided the foundation and the lifestyle, the trade routes leading east provided something entirely different.
They provided the mechanics of transcending human limits.
Exactly. The text transitions from the Levant, moves eastward down the Silk Road, and lands squarely in the Indian subcontinent. Here's where it gets really interesting.
This transition eastward represents a major shift in the text's analysis. It argues that the Islamic Empire's expansion into regions influenced by Hinduism, Buddhism, and yogic traditions fundamentally altered the internal psychological mechanics of how Sufis attempted to reach altered states of consciousness.
If Christianity gave them the why should I be poor, why should I love God? India gave them the how.
Well said.
The text details incredible theological and operational parallels that suggest a deep structural absorption of Indian spiritual technologies. Let's break down the philosophical shifts first. The text begins with Brahmanism and the concept of meditation.
Right. So the ancient Indian quest for spiritual perfection is deeply rooted in the concept of realizing that the individual soul, the Atman, is fundamentally identical to the ultimate universal reality, Brahman.
The goal is to shatter the illusion of separation.
Exactly. And our source text argues that this specific Indian philosophical framework heavily influenced the highly controversial Sufi concept of hulul, or incarnation.
Let's explain hulu carefully, because from an Orthodox Islamic perspective, this is where the alarms start blaring.
Oh, absolutely.
Hulu is the idea that the divine essence can physically inhabit, dwell within, or become entirely one with a human form.
It is arguably the most fiercely debated concept in Islamic theology. Strict Islamic monotheism maintains an impassable, absolute ontological barrier between the creator and the created.
A human can be pious, a human can be a prophet, but a human can never be God, nor can God inhabit a human.
Right. And the source text points out that because this idea of divine incarnation is so utterly alien to Quranic theology, its emergence in Sufi circles must be the result of a foreign import. Specifically, the Indian concept of the soul merging with Brahman.
The author then moves to Buddhism, drawing a straight line between the Buddhist concept of nirvana and the Sufi concept of fana. And when you look at the mechanics of both, they sound identical.
They really do.
Nirvana isn't heaven. It's the extinguishing of the self, the end of desire, a total cessation of the individual ego, allowing the practitioner to return to the universal source.
The author argues that fana is simply nirvana wrapped in an Arabic vocabulary. But the philosophical overlaps don't stop at the individual ego. The text tackles the macro philosophy of pantheism, which in the Sufi tradition is known as wadat al-wujud, or the unity of being.
This is a mind-bending concept. Wadat al-wujud asserts that there is only one true existence in the entire universe.
Everything we see, from the stars in the sky to the trees, the animals, and ourselves, is just a different manifestation of the single divine essence.
There is no actual separation between the creator and the creation. God is everything, and everything is God.
The author notes that this is an ancient bedrock belief of Indian philosophy. And again, it presents a massive mathematical and theological threat to Orthodox Islam. If God is everything, then who is praying and who is being prayed to?
It collapses the entire structure of divine law and judgment.
Exactly. The text insists that a philosophical shift of this magnitude could not have evolved natively from the stark monotheism of the Arabian desert. It was a conceptual virus, so to speak, traveling westward along the trade routes.
But the text doesn't just focus on high-level philosophy. It gets incredibly granular about the physical practices. It explicitly tackles yoga.
And we have to be clear here, the text isn't talking about the modernized, stretching, focused yoga you might do in a studio on a Tuesday morning.
Right, no. It is analyzing ancient, intense yogic asceticism.
The ancient Indian ascetics utilized incredibly painful, punishing physical disciplines, holding limbs in awkward positions for years, extreme breath control, starvation, all designed to completely break the body's desires and master the physical form.
And crucially, they paired this physiological torture with the relentless, repetitive chanting of specific mantras.
Right. The source text draws a direct mechanical line from these extreme Indian practices to the physical mortifications, breath control techniques, and rhythmic chanting utilized in advanced Sufidic rituals.
The argument is that the Sufis adopted the physiological technologies developed by yogis to essentially hack the human nervous system.
Yes, but the author goes even further than physiological hacks.
Yeah, this is the part of the text that really made me pause. The source brings up an ancient Indian text called the Patanjali, which outlines the specific superpowers or miraculous abilities that an advanced yogi supposedly acquires.
And it maps these exact powers directly onto the Sufi concept of karamat, which are the miracles historically attributed to great Sufi saints.
The text lists 8 specific powers from the Patanjali, and the correlation the author builds is fascinating because it moves beyond shared philosophy into shared mythology.
Right, let's talk about the threat this poses rather than just listing them like magic tricks.
Exactly. For example, the Patanjali claims yogis can achieve invisibility and weightlessness, like walking on water. The text points out that early Sufi literature is absolutely flooded with identical claims, saints vanishing from sight or crossing raging rivers without a boat.
There is also the claim of enlargement, the ability to grow so large you fill a room, representing total spatial dominance. But the most significant power mentioned is the concept of folding space.
Oh, this one is wild. The author specifically highlights a classic trope in Sufi hagiography, a saint who prays the morning prayer in a city like Medina and instantaneously teleports to pray the noon prayer hundreds of miles away in Mecca.
And from an Orthodox perspective, this isn't just a fun story, it's a theological crisis. If any mystic can bend the laws of physics at will, it blurs the line between a saint and a prophet.
But the powers listed in the text get even more psychologically dangerous. The Patanjali lists the ability to fulfill any desire instantly and the power of absolute omniscience, knowing any desired information anywhere in the universe.
The author argues that this yogic claim of omniscience was absorbed directly into the extreme interpretations of Kash, that unveiling we talked about.
Right, because if a Sufi master claims to have unlimited access to the universe's hidden knowledge, he fundamentally elevates himself above the need for scripture or traditional religious law.
The law becomes irrelevant to someone who can read the mind of God directly.
Which leads directly to the final 2 powers listed from the Patanjali: absolute leadership over a group and total blind obedience from subordinates.
When you put omniscience and absolute obedience together, you aren't talking about a study group anymore.
No, you are talking about the structural dynamics of a cult.
And that is the exact warning the source text is issuing. The author argues that by absorbing these specific Indian mythologies, the Sufi tradition cemented a highly dangerous, unquestionable authority structure.
The disciple, the murid, must be like a corpse in the hands of the washer when submitting to the sheikh.
Right. The text views this absolute destruction of the disciple's independent critical thought as a direct import of the Hindu guru-disciple dynamic, framing it as entirely foreign and hostile to the egalitarian ideals of early Islam.
To synthesize this entire Indian influence argument, the text points to a much later figure, Ramakrishna, a 19th century Hindu mystic. Even though he exists centuries after the time period we're discussing, the author uses him as the ultimate, pristine archetype of this Eastern asceticism.
The relentless focus on ego death, the manifestation of miraculous powers, the absolute unquestioning devotion of the disciples.
The text argues that if you look at Ramakrishna, you are looking at the unvarnished DNA of the Sufi master-disciple relationship.
It's a bold methodological choice by the author to use a modern figure to prove an ancient point, but it effectively illustrates the structural argument. The software running the Sufi operating system, the author claims, was coded in India.
But the Silk Road goes even further than the Indian subcontinent. The text pushes our geographical boundaries all the way to ancient China, examining what it calls the Chinese philosophical mirror.
We are taken back to the 7th century BC to look at Lao Tzu and the foundational text of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching.
Here, the text shifts back from physical practices and methodological powers to structural philosophy and linguistics. The author points out striking similarities between foundational Taoist concepts and Sufi terminology, specifically the concepts of Tao and Te.
Right. Tao translates roughly to the way or the path. It is the fundamental flowing nature of the universe.
And in Sufism, the entire spiritual journey is called the tariqa, which literally translates to the way or the path.
And Te represents divine grace, kindness, or the inner power that allows one to harmonize with the Tao. The author argues that this perfectly mirrors the Sufi reliance on divine grace, or inaya, to complete their journey.
But the core of the author's argument rests on the structural sequence of the spiritual journey. Lao Tzu outlined 3 distinct, necessary stages to harmonize with the Tao.
Right. Stage 1 is the rigorous purification of the soul and the shedding of worldly attachments. Stage 2 is illumination, a sudden dawning of universal understanding. And stage 3 is the ultimate goal, union with the Tao.
And the source text maps this onto the Sufi path with incredible precision. In Sufism, the journey must begin with tazkiyah, the rigorous purification of the self and the taming of the lower desires.
Which inevitably leads to ishraq, which is illumination, or the sudden flash of kash we discussed earlier.
Right. And the final, ultimate destination is ittihad, or absolute union with the divine reality. It is the exact same 3-step staircase. First you clean the mirror, then the light hits the mirror, and finally you become the light.
The author's thesis is that this structural identicality cannot be a coincidence. The text argues that early Islamic scholars and ascetics must have had contact with Taoist thought, likely through the massive multicultural trade hubs of Central Asia, where Persian, Arab, Indian, and Chinese merchants and ideas constantly intermingled.
Okay, this is where I have to step in and push back on the author's underlying assumption again, because it brings up a massive debate in comparative religion. I understand that the Silk Road was an information superhighway. I get that ideas traveled with silk and spices.
Sure.
But the text is implying a literal translation and adoption of 7th century BC Chinese texts by 8th century Arab or Persian mystics. Are we absolutely sure that someone had to read someone else's notes?
It's a fair question.
I mean, if we look at human neurobiology, isn't it entirely possible that the human brain is simply wired to experience mysticism in this exact 3-step sequence? If you take an individual in a cave in China, an individual in the deserts of Syria, and tell them both to seek the ultimate truth, won't they both realize they first have to stop caring about money purification? Then they will eventually have an epiphany illumination, and then they will feel connected to the universe union.
Does structural similarity prove plagiarism?
Exactly.
That is a phenomenal question, and it represents the primary counterargument to the text's entire methodology. Are we looking at historical transmission, or are we looking at the universal default biological architecture of human spirituality?
Right.
However, to accurately reflect the source material we are analyzing today, the author fiercely rejects the biological or convergent evolution theory. The text insists on a historical, philosophical lineage.
And what's their primary reasoning for that?
It's theological, because the final stage of this process, absolute union with the divine, ittihad so fundamentally contradicts the core, foundational Islamic doctrine of God's absolute separation from creation. Its presence within the Islamic world must be the result of external ideological contagion.
I see.
The author argues that a devout Muslim would never naturally arrive at the conclusion that they could become God unless the idea was introduced to them by a foreign philosophy. Therefore, the author insists on causality, not coincidence.
Fair enough. We're here to map the source's argument, and the source's argument is that the architectural plans for this 3-step staircase were imported from the East.
So we've covered the psychological mechanics from Judaism, the lifestyle and emotional vocabulary from Christianity, the physical hacks and cosmological shifts from India, and the structural journey from China.
But we're missing a crucial piece. How do the early Sufis articulate these wild, ecstatic, mind-bending experiences? They needed an intellectual framework to legitimize what they were feeling.
They needed a highly sophisticated vocabulary to defend themselves against the orthodox scholars who were accusing them of heresy.
And for that, the text turns to what we might call the philosopher's stone, Greek and Persian thought.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this section of the text delves into the intellectual and linguistic scaffolding of Sufism. It starts by looking back at the geopolitical legacy of Alexander the Great.
Right. When Alexander conquered his way across the known world, from Greece to India, he didn't just take territory. He initiated a massive, forceful, and permanent collision of cultures.
The intellectual software of Hellenistic thought was planted firmly in the soil of the Middle East, Egypt, and Persia, centuries before the Prophet Muhammad was even born.
The intellectual groundwork was already laid. And the text even brings up a fascinating linguistic theory here. We mentioned earlier that Sufi likely comes from suf, the Arabic word for wool. But the author presents an alternative theory, debated by scholars, that the word Sufi might actually be an Arabic transliteration of the Greek word Sophia, meaning wisdom, the root of the word philosophy, love of wisdom.
While that etymology is debated, it perfectly encapsulates the author's point about Greek intellectual influence. The source argues that Greek philosophy, specifically the later traditions of Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, provided the precise intellectual vocabulary that Sufis used to explain the indescribable.
It gave them a complex, deeply respected philosophical language to legitimize their mystical states to the highly intellectual society of the Islamic Golden Age.
And the text heavily highlights a specific philosopher named Plotinus. We need to unpack who he was and exactly what his framework provided to Sufism, because his ideas seem to be the engine of Islamic mystical cosmology.
Plotinus was a major Neoplatonic philosopher operating in the 3rd century. He developed a highly influential theory regarding the nature of the universe known as divine emanation, or in the Arabic translation, al-Fayd.
To understand this, we have to look at how Orthodox religion views creation. Traditional monotheism views God as a craftsman. God is separate from the wood, and he actively builds a table. There is a clear distinction between the creator and the created object.
But Plotinus completely rejected this. He proposed that we should think of God not as a craftsman, but as an infinite, blindingly powerful sun.
Right. The sun doesn't build light. The light simply overflows from the sun's own inescapable nature. The light radiating outward isn't a separate creation. It is an extension, a dilution of the sun's own essence.
That is the theory of emanation. Plotinus proposed a strict cosmic hierarchy. At the absolute center is the One, the unknowable source. The One overflows into the first intellect.
The first intellect overflows into the universal soul, and that energy eventually cascades all the way down into the dense, dark material world we live in.
So under this framework, human beings are essentially trapped sunbeams. We are a divine light that has fallen so far from the source that we've become trapped in the mud of the material world. And the mystic's job is to travel back up the sunbeam to merge with the One.
The source text is arguing that this massive 3rd century Greek philosophical shift was essentially copy-pasted into Islamic mysticism.
Oh.
The author draws a direct, unmistakable parallel between Plotinus's emanation and later Sufi cosmology. The text points specifically to highly complex, systemized frameworks developed by later famous Sufi thinkers like Ibn Arabi.
Ibn Arabi's intricate theories regarding the perfect man and the various descending levels of divine manifestation are, according to our source, essentially Neoplatonic philosophy dressed up in Quranic terminology.
The author argues that Ibn Arabi didn't invent his cosmology, he simply Islamicized Plotinus.
But let's look at the mechanics of that transmission. How did a 3rd century Greek text actually end up in the hands of an 8th or 9th century Muslim mystic sitting in Baghdad or Damascus?
The text explains this through the mechanics of the translation movement. During the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, the Islamic Empire experienced a massive explosion of wealth and intellectual curiosity.
Right. The state, particularly through institutions like the House of Wisdom, sponsored an unprecedented massive effort to translate all the known knowledge of the ancient world into Arabic. They wanted the medicine, the geometry, the astronomy.
But it wasn't just secular science that got translated. The intellectual dragnet caught everything.
The text highlights a specific figure named Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a Christian theologian deeply, heavily influenced by Neoplatonic thought. Why does the author focus on him?
Because Pseudo-Dionysius crystallized the concept of deification. This is the precise intellectual argument that by silencing the physical body, isolating oneself from the material world, and aggressively purifying the heart, a human being can achieve true divine knowledge and actually become godlike.
He provided a step-by-step intellectual justification for the ascetic practices we discussed earlier.
Exactly. And the source notes the specific middlemen in this intellectual exchange. It points out that Syriac Gnostic monks, such as a man named Stephen Barsudeli, were the ones championing these ideas.
These Syriac Christians were often bilingual or trilingual. They spoke Greek, they spoke Syriac, and they learned Arabic. When the Caliphate started paying for translations, these monks translated their own mystical Gnostic texts into Arabic.
The author argues that this specific pipeline flooded the Islamic intellectual world with Greek mystical concepts, and this flood permanently altered the Arabic vocabulary.
The text argues that the Greeks provided the dictionary that the Sufis used to write their theology. Words that are now considered the absolute bedrock of Sufism were actually forged in this translation movement.
Let's look at a few other specific terms. There is marifa. In a traditional Islamic context, knowledge is ilm knowledge you gain from reading a book or studying a science.
But marifa is different. The text links it to the Greek concept of gnosis. It is deep, intuitive, spiritual knowledge that cannot be taught. It must be experienced.
There is also the concept of dak. The literal Arabic translation is taste. But in the Sufi lexicon, thanks to this intellectual cross-pollination, it came to refer to direct, personal, undeniable spiritual experience.
You cannot explain the taste of honey to someone who has never eaten it. They must experience the dak.
And we return to Kosh, the unveiling. The author insists that this entire linguistic framework was a necessary adaptation, allowing Sufis to survive in a highly intellectualized society by masking foreign ecstatic experiences in sophisticated philosophical Arabic.
Which brings us to the final piece of the architectural puzzle analyzed in our source text, the Persian echoes.
The text points out a striking, undeniable demographic fact. If you look at the historical all-star team of the most famous foundational early Sufis figures like Ibrahim bin Adam, Maruf al-Karki, Bayezid al-Bastami, Mansur al-Hallaj,
A massive, overwhelming percentage of them were of Persian descent. As we said earlier, geography is destiny.
in the author's analysis, demographic origin is the key to understanding the theology. The source argues that when the ancient Persian Sassanid Empire was conquered by the Arab armies, the vast Persian population eventually converted to Islam.
But they possessed thousands of years of rich, deeply entrenched religious history. They didn't just abandon their entire psychological architecture.
No, they brought their pre-Islamic cosmological beliefs with them into their new faith, synthesizing the old with the new.
The text highlights two specific pre-Islamic Persian religions to make this point: Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism. Let's start with Manichaeism. What specific concepts did this religion smuggle into early Persian Sufism?
Manichaeism was a fiercely dualistic religion. It viewed the universe as a literal battleground between two distinct realms: the realm of light, which was purely spiritual and good, and the realm of darkness, which was physical, material, and inherently evil.
Therefore, according to Manichaean logic, the human body made of physical matter was a prison of evil darkness, trapping the divine soul.
Exactly. To be holy, you had to aggressively punish the physical body. They practiced strict vegetarianism, refusing to consume flesh, and engaged in severe self-denial.
And the source links this deep-seated pre-Islamic hatred of the material form directly to the punishing physical regimes and extreme asceticism of the early Persian Sufis we just mentioned. It was a pre-existing cultural trauma expressing itself in a new religious framework.
And then there is Zoroastrianism, the ancient state religion of the Persian Empire, often associated with fire and light.
How does the text connect that to Sufi theology?
Well, Zoroastrianism is also fundamentally dualistic, focusing on the cosmic battle between the supreme creator of light, Ahura Mazda, and the destructive spirit of darkness. Beneath that dualism lies a deeper cosmological concept.
Right.
It involves the idea of a singular, supreme, unknowable source from which these forces emanate. The source text argues that this ancient Persian cosmology of light seeking to escape darkness cemented the foundation for the core Sufi doctrine of the return to the source.
The idea that the human soul is quite literally a trapped spark of divine fire, yearning to escape the cold darkness of the material world and return to the original unified blaze.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean? Let's step back and look at the building we've just constructed. We have covered a staggering amount of geographical, historical, and theological ground. Let's try to synthesize this massive journey for you, the listener.
We started with a source text that had a very clear critical mission: to aggressively deconstruct Sufism and argue that it is not a purely native Islamic phenomenon.
The central thesis of the author is that if you look closely at Sufism, you are not looking at a single unified theology. You are looking at an incredibly complex, highly syncretic tapestry.
According to the text, it's a tapestry woven in the dark rooms of Judaism, absorbing concepts of prophecy and the reverence of the master.
It was wearing the patchwool of Christian monks, adopting their extreme poverty and their poetic, intimate language of divine love.
It is utilizing the intense breathwork, the physical disciplines, and the mythological claims of miraculous superpowers born in the yogic traditions of India.
It is walking the exact three-step structural staircase to enlightenment mapped out by Chinese Taoist sages centuries earlier.
It is defending itself using the highly intellectual emanationist vocabulary of Greek Neoplatonism, translated by Syriac monks in Baghdad.
And the entire engine is driven by the dualistic, light-seeking cosmology of ancient Persia.
And this brings us to the core reason why you should care about the analysis we've explored in this deep dive.
Right. Regardless of whether you agree with the source text's highly critical, puritanical stance, the idea that this syncretism is a negative corruption of a pure faith, the historical mechanics it maps out are undeniably fascinating.
It fundamentally changes how we view human religious history. It destroys the illusion of isolation. It shows us that borders, both geographical lines on a map and rigid theological doctrines, were incredibly porous.
We have a modern tendency to put ancient religions into neat, hermetically sealed boxes. We say, this is Islam over here, this is Christianity over there, this is Hinduism down there. They're separate software systems that don't interface.
But the reality of human history, as demonstrated by the sheer volume of connections in our source text, doesn't work like that. Ideas were the ultimate currency.
They traveled on camelback, right alongside the physical commodities of spices and silk. A Christian monk meditating in the Syrian desert has a conversation with a Muslim merchant traveling from Baghdad.
That merchant buys a manuscript translated from Greek by a bilingual scholar. He travels down the Silk Road, reads the text, and later watches a Hindu yogi perform extreme breathwork.
He synthesizes these experiences and writes a poem. Ideas mutate, they cross-pollinate, they adapt to survive the harsh environments of new empires.
This text, even in its attempt to criticize and isolate Sufism, inadvertently paints a magnificent picture of human intellectual interconnectedness.
It really does. By trying to prove that it's a Frankenstein's monster of stolen parts, the author accidentally proves that humanity has always, fundamentally, been a global community sharing ideas on how to reach the divine.
Absolutely.
Which brings me back to where we started today. Remember that architectural metaphor, the building with the Roman foundation, the Gothic arches, the Asian roof tiles? We spent the last hour meticulously peeling back the wallpaper alongside our source text, identifying every single foreign brick.
The author of the text we read is absolutely, unequivocally convinced that these bricks were physically imported, that they were plagiarized, borrowed, copied, and smuggled across borders.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about the rest of your day, a thought that pushes past the historical argument of our text. If the core, fundamental human desire to strip away the ego, to isolate oneself in darkness, and to seek a singular, unifying, ecstatic truth exists identically in the texts of ancient China, the lecture halls of ancient Greece, the ashrams of Hindu India, and the deserts of the Islamic Middle East. Wait, let me rephrase that.
It's a profound thought.
If that desire is everywhere, does that definitively mean these ancient cultures were all just looking over each other's shoulders and reading each other's notes? Or does it point to something even more profound? Does it mean that there is a universal inherent biological architecture to the human soul? That no matter what century we are born in, what geographical borders surround us, or what specific theological vocabulary we use, the human mind is neurologically programmed to build the exact same staircase when trying to reach the divine? Something to think about. Until next time. So think about the concept of distance for a second. And I don't mean, physical distance, but relational distance.
Right, like emotional or spiritual distance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because in basically any standard theological framework, the entire architecture of the faith is built on this very specific, completely uncrossable gap.
Mm-hmm.
You've got divine on one side,
Right.
infinite, transcendent, uncreated.
Yeah.
And then you have humanity on the other side,
Yep.
finite, limited, created.
Yeah, and the whole point of the religion, like the rituals, the prayers, the laws, it's all designed to reach across that gap.
Right, to get closer.
Yeah.
But the fundamental rule, the absolute bedrock of it all, is that the gap itself never actually closes.
No, never. You can approach the threshold, but you never step over it.
Because stepping over it dismantles the entire structure.
It really does. I mean, if the gap closes entirely, you no longer have a relationship between a creator and a creation. You just have a singularity.
A singularity, wow.
Yeah, and that singularity is exactly what the academic and historical texts we're analyzing today are so fiercely critiquing.
And welcome, by the way, to another deep dive. We are super glad to have you, the listener, with us today.
Definitely.
Because today we are exploring some truly mind-bending concepts. We're unpacking the doctrines of figures like Abu Yazid al-Bastami, Ibn Arabi, and Ibn al-Farid.
Yeah, these are thinkers who didn't just want to get closer to the divine, they basically wanted to obliterate the gap completely.
Which is just a wild ambition when you really think about
Yeah.
it. And I should mention right up front, the source material we're working from today, it does not view this as some beautiful, poetic, spiritual
Yeah.
endeavor.
Oh, not at all.
No. These critical texts label these concepts as outright heresy. They call them atheistic deviations, and basically an existential threat to the religion itself.
Yeah, the critics were not holding back.
They really weren't. And just to set a quick baseline for you listening, we aren't here to play theologian or pick sides, right?
Right, exactly. We're totally impartial here.
We're just your guides. We're mapping out the mechanics of these extreme mystical philosophies, how they fundamentally rewrote reality, and, why the historical pushback was so incredibly intense.
And the pushback was intense because the stakes were just absolute. I mean, the critics writing our source text understood something fundamental.
What's that?
They knew that if you allow the boundary between the divine and the human to dissolve even for a single moment, the entire Orthodox framework just collapses.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, you lose the necessity of law, you lose the definition of sin, and you even lose the historical reality of the prophets.
Wow. Okay, so where does it start?
Well, the text points to the concept of hulu,
Kulu.
right, which means incarnation or divine indwelling. The sources see this as the first major fracture in that boundary.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the sources highlight Abu Yazid al-Bistami as the prime historical example of this rupture.
They do, yeah.
So we have this mystic who, according to the historical records, claims to have been spiritually elevated to stand directly before the divine. And the request he makes in that state is just staggering.
It really is.
He allegedly says, adorn me with your unity and clothe me in your I-ness, so that if your creation sees me, they say, we have seen you.
What's really fascinating here is the specific mechanism he's asking for.
Right.
He isn't asking for divine grace. He's not asking to be, a faithful conduit of God's will.
No, he's asking to be clothed in I-ness.
Exactly. The Arabic concept of ananiya. He wants the subjective identity of the divine to literally become his own subjective identity.
So it's not just, let me be a good servant.
No, the critical texts analyze this not as a metaphor for spiritual alignment, but as an active attempt to usurp the divine essence.
It functions almost like a metaphysical identity theft.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, if I put on your I-ness, then when the world interacts with me, they're fundamentally interacting with you.
Exactly.
But from a purely psychological standpoint, how does a person even begin to process that level of self-erasure?
It's hard to imagine.
Right. To wake up and walk through an ordinary Tuesday believing that the face in the mirror is no longer human.
Well, that is the core friction. The sources argue that this level of self-erasure requires a completely radical detachment from tangible reality.
I bet.
And the critics view al-Bastami's claim as deeply arrogant.
Because he's bypassing humility.
Yes, exactly, because it bypassed the required humility of a servant. To the Orthodox mind, a true servant realizes their absolute insignificance in the face of the divine.
Right, you're supposed to be small.
Yeah, but al-Bastami, however, he flips that equation entirely.
Oh, wow.
He uses his spiritual state to absorb the divine into his own human vessel. He essentially makes himself the focal point of worship.
But surely the immediate community around him must have reacted, right? I mean, if you walk into a marketplace and declare, if you see me, you see God, you aren't just making a theological statement.
No, you're really not.
You're challenging the entire social and religious order of the society.
And they did react. These early claims of Hulul were met with really severe condemnation.
I can imagine.
But the critical texts we're reading don't just view al-Bastami as an isolated incident, like, just one mystic going too far.
How do they view it then?
They analyze this moment as the initial fatal crack in the dam.
Oh, so it's a precedent.
Exactly. Once the precedent is set that the divine can dwell within a single human being, the logical boundaries are completely breached. It introduces a viral idea into the intellectual bloodstream.
Because if the divine can be contained in one person, the natural philosophical follow-up is, well, why just one person?
Right.
Why not the tree outside? Why not the earth? Why not the entire universe?
Yeah, and that pulls us directly into the concept of Wadat al-Wujud.
Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of existence.
Yes, and this is where the philosophy scales up to a massive cosmic level.
So we're moving past just one guy.
Way past. Wadat al-Wujud doesn't just blur the line between creator and creation. It argues that the line literally never existed in the first place.
Wait, really? Never existed?
Never. Existence is a single, undivided reality. In this framework, there is no other.
So what about, like, physical objects?
Everything we perceive as separate, the sun, the mountains, other people, ourselves, they are merely different manifestations or reflections of the one divine essence.
That is huge. And Ibn Arabi is the towering figure here, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's central to this.
Because the texts point to his massive works, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah and Fusus al-Hikam. And the claim is that God is the actual essence of all created things.
Yes.
And he pushes this to such degree that the duality of worship just collapses completely.
Yeah, he writes poetry questioning the actual difference between the worshiper and the worshipped.
Right, because if existence is entirely one, then any act of prayer is essentially the divine praying to the divine.
The structural implications of that are just massive. I mean, the critics highlight this as the ultimate destruction of monotheism.
How so? Just because of the lack of separation?
Yeah, because monotheism fundamentally relies on a distinction. You have the one who is worshipped and the many who worship him. But by collapsing the many into the one, Ibn Arabi, according to our texts at least, essentially creates a really sophisticated form of atheism.
Atheism. That's a harsh label for a mystic.
The critics argue that if everything is God, then the concept of God loses all distinct meaning. It just becomes another word for the universe.
Oh, I see. If everyone's super, no one is.
Exactly.
The sources also bring in Ibn al-Farid and his famous poem, Al-Taya, to illustrate how this played out practically. And honestly, the examples are wild.
They really are. What stood out to you?
Well, he claims that God appeared to Adam in the form of Eve.
Yeah.
And he claims that when you look at the famous tragic romances of Arabic literature, like Laila or Buthaina, the intense, burning passion the lover feels is actually directed at the divine.
Right, because the beloved is just a manifestation of God.
Exactly. He is attempting to sanctify human desire by claiming its ultimate object is always divine.
Yeah, but the critical texts focus really heavily on another claim in Al-Taya, specifically regarding Zoroastrians.
Oh, right, the Magians.
Yeah. Zoroastrianism historically involves the veneration of fire. And Ibn al-Farid writes that when the Magians were worshiping the fire, they were, in absolute reality, worshiping God.
Because God is the underlying essence of that fire.
Precisely.
Let's drill down into that, because the sources mention this idea is influenced by Magian thought and other foreign philosophies.
They do.
And the Zoroastrian or Magian framework is a very specific cosmological duality, right? Light and dark, fire as a pure element.
Yes, very specific.
By saying the fire is the divine essence, Ibn al-Farid isn't just offering a hot take on another religion. He's suggesting that the very act of idolatry is secretly monotheistic.
Yes, and that is what absolutely infuriated the Orthodox scholars writing these critiques.
Because it validates the idol.
Exactly. The entire mission of the prophets historically was to smash idols, to redirect worship away from created things and toward the uncreated creator.
So Ibn al-Farid is basically undoing all that work.
Right. He is essentially arguing that the prophets were operating on a lower level of understanding. In his view, the idol worshiper is actually correct in their devotion.
They just don't know it.
Exactly. They are just mistakenly focusing on the specific form, the idol or the fire, rather than the universal essence.
Which completely nullifies the concept of divine revelation.
It really does.
Because if the fire is God, and the idol is God, and the tragic romantic lover is God,
Yeah.
why send a book? Why send laws?
That's the question.
If every direction you turn is the divine essence, then wandering off the path is impossible. Because there is no path. Everywhere is the destination.
And that's exactly why the critics argue this dismantles the moral universe.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah. Because if there is no separate human will, if the essence of every action is literally the divine moving through a physical form, then how do you categorize a crime?
Exactly. How do you categorize cruelty or oppression?
You can't.
That is the ultimate logical trap. If a person commits a horrific act of violence, and what that al-Wujud holds that there is only one true actor in the entire universe, then you are forced to attribute that horrific act to the divine essence.
Yeah, it provides a terrifying philosophical cover for literally any behavior.
That's so dangerous.
The texts view this as the supreme danger of pantheistic thought. It is an antinomian philosophy.
Antinomian meaning anti-law.
Right, fundamentally opposed to religious law. The Orthodox scholars argue that this mindset breeds a dangerous passivity and moral relativism.
It just removes the friction of moral choice.
Yes. It replaces it with a fatalistic acceptance that everything, no matter how destructive it is simply a manifestation of the one.
But here's my question. People don't just naturally perceive the universe this way,
You're right,
right?
of course not.
Our daily experience is deeply, deeply rooted in separation. I am here, you are there, this microphone is on the table.
Right.
To genuinely perceive the universe as a single, undivided essence that requires a massive psychological rewiring.
It does. It requires an active dismantling of the ego. Which brings us to the methodology behind these claims.
Okay, the how-to.
Yes, the state of fana, or annihilation, and the concept of wadat al-shur.
Edaroshur, the unity of witnessing.
Exactly.
The sources are pretty clear that this isn't achieved through, like, reading theology textbooks in a library.
Definitely not.
It is achieved through intense, repetitive, physical and vocal practices.
Yeah.
Specifically Disker, prolonged chanting.
Right. Now, Dik in Orthodox practice is simply the remembrance of God. It's a standard devotional act.
Just a normal part of the religion.
Yeah, but these extreme groups, according to the text, weaponize the practice.
Weaponized it. How?
Well, by engaging in rhythmic, repetitive chanting for hours, sometimes accompanied by hyperventilation or physical exhaustion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They intentionally induced an altered state of consciousness. They systematically shut down the rational, distinguishing faculties of the brain.
You know, I think the best way to understand the mechanism of this is to look at the concept of a flow state.
A flow state. Okay, tell me more.
So imagine a master jazz musician playing the saxophone.
Mm-hmm.
They get so deep into the improvisation, the muscle memory just completely takes over. The analytical part of the brain shuts off.
Right. They aren't thinking about the notes anymore?
Exactly. And they reach a point where they genuinely cannot feel, where their fingertips end and the brass keys begin. The duality of musician and instrument just vanishes.
That's a great analogy.
In their subjective experience, they literally are the music.
And that analogy perfectly captures the psychological phenomenon of fana. The mystic chants until the boundary between the witness and the witnessed dissolves.
The witness and the witness.
Yes. They enter what the texts call hal al-jam, the state of gathering.
Hal al-jam.
In that profound psychological trance, they experience wadal al-shud. They witness only unity. The ego, the I, is entirely annihilated.
Now, to be fair, defenders of this practice often try to argue that this is purely subjective.
I do, yeah.
They claim the mystic isn't making, like, a scientific statement about the physics of the universe. They're just describing an overwhelming internal experience.
Right. They feel as if they are one with the universe, but deep down they know they are still human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But our source material aggressively rejects that defense.
Oh, completely.
The critics argue that you cannot separate the internal state from the external theological claims being made.
Right. Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, when a mystic emerges from that state of fana and begins preaching that the universe is a single essence, they are translating a psychological trance into a literal theological doctrine.
Going back to the jazz analogy, if the musician finishes the gig and then demands the rest of the band treat him like a literal saxophone, we have a problem.
Exactly. That's exactly it. The subjective experience is overriding objective reality.
And that's what the critics were afraid of.
Yes. The critics argue that this unity of witnessing inevitably leads right back to hulul and wadat al-wujud. Even if it starts as just a feeling, it calcifies into a belief system. Wow.
And the texts point out a massive paradox created by the state of annihilation.
What paradox?
If the mystic's ego is entirely gone, if the human vessel is completely emptied of its own well, who exactly is left to interact with the world?
Oh. Right, because nature abhors a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
If you successfully annihilate your identity, something has to rush in to fill that space.
And according to the texts, what rushes in is a completely radicalized cosmic version of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, this is where the theology takes a massive structural turn.
A huge turn. The concept is al-Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya, the Mohammedan reality.
And to understand why the sources find this so deeply heretical, we really have to look at the massive gap between the historical prophet and this cosmic entity the mystics created.
Yes, the historical baseline is really crucial here.
Standard orthodoxy insists on the absolute humanity of Muhammad, right?
Right. Completely mortal.
He was a Moorland, chosen as a messenger. He experienced grief. He bled in battle. He made strategic decisions. and, he died.
The Quran repeatedly emphasizes his mortality to prevent exactly the kind of deification that happened in other religions.
But these extreme mystical groups essentially took that historical human being and reverse engineered him into the foundational fabric of the universe.
Which is mind-blowing.
The sources detail a cosmological origin story that sounds remarkably like Greek philosophy.
Greek philosophy, like Plato.
Very close. Neoplatonism. They posit that before the creation of the universe, the divine existed in a state called Amma, which usually translates to a state of blindness or a heavy, unmanifested cloud, right?
Exactly. It represents absolute hidden potential, the unknowable essence.
Okay.
The theory claims that when the divine decided to manifest out of this hidden state, the very first emanation, the first spark of existence, was the light or the reality of Muhammad.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, Muhammad isn't just a prophet born in 6th century Arabia. He is the primal manifestation of God. He is the blueprint of all existence.
I'm reading this and immediately seeing the fingerprints of Neoplatonism.
This is emanation theory. The idea that there is the one, the unknowable perfect source, and from the one emanates the nares or the first intellect.
Yes.
It seems like these mystical groups took the Greek concept of the first intellect, or even the Christian concept of the logos.
The word made flesh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they simply mapped the name Muhammad onto it.
The critical texts draw those exact same parallels. They argue that this entire cosmological structure is basically an invasive species of thought.
An invasive species. I like that phrasing.
It was imported from Hellenistic philosophy and grafted onto Islamic terminology. By turning the prophet into the first intellect, or the logos, they fundamentally altered the mechanics of the religion.
The texts cite a staggering claim by Ibn Arabi regarding the hijra.
Oh, yes. The historical migration of the prophet from Mecca to Medina.
Right. Ibn Arabi supposedly claimed that the entity migrating across the desert wasn't just a human being escaping persecution.
What did he claim it was?
He claimed it was the divine essence itself in motion.
Wow. See, he is rewriting historical reality into a mythological cosmic event.
Right.
Because if Muhammad is the primary manifestation of the divine essence, then every action he took was physically the action of the divine.
That completely changes the narrative.
And it gets bigger. The theory states that the entire physical universe was subsequently created out of the light of Muhammad.
So everything is a derivative of his light.
Exactly. And the practical consequence of this is that the prophet never truly dies.
Wait, really? Because historically he obviously did.
Sure, but in this framework, if he is the underlying reality of the cosmos, physical death is just a shedding of the outer shell.
Oh, I see.
These groups believe he is physically and spiritually present everywhere, actively controlling and managing the affairs of the universe.
He transforms from a historical messenger who delivered the law to the literal operating system of reality.
The operating system, yes.
But if the prophet is an omnipresent cosmic frequency rather than a historical figure, that completely changes how a believer interacts with him. Well, you don't just read his historical biography. You try to tune into his frequency.
And that desire to tune in, to access that cosmic frequency directly, birthed an entirely new hierarchical structure of authority.
Here we go.
Yes. It gave rise to the concept of the Aliyah, the saints, and their claim to Ilm Laduni.
Ilm Laduni, which is esoteric, divine knowledge.
Right.
This is where the philosophical theories really hit the ground and disrupt everyday life. Because if the cosmic prophet is out there managing the universe, how do you communicate with him?
Good question.
The sources detail how these Sufi groups developed a rigid spiritual pyramid to answer that.
Right, a hierarchy.
At the very top, you have the Quated, the pole or axis of the universe. And below him, various ranks of saints who serve as the spiritual nervous system of the world.
The texts are highly critical of where this structural idea came from, actually.
Where do they say it came from?
They argue that these Sufi groups essentially lifted the concept of the infallible imam from Shiite theology and retrofitted it for their own purposes.
Oh, wow. Just borrowed it entirely.
Yeah. They established a secret spiritual pipeline, claiming that their saints inherit this esoteric knowledge directly from the prophet, usually tracing the lineage through his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib.
But this raises an important question, because Ilm Laduni isn't just advanced scholarly knowledge, right?
No, not at all.
It isn't something you get by spending 40 years in a library studying syntax, jurisprudence, and historical chains of narration.
No. It is the exact opposite of acquired knowledge.
Okay.
Ilm Laduni is divine inspiration downloaded directly into the heart of the saint. It completely bypasses the intellect, the texts, and the historical sciences.
That's convenient.
The saint doesn't interpret the law. The saint receives the ultimate truth directly from the source.
Which creates a massive epistemological crisis for the Orthodox establishment.
Massive.
I mean, if a saint claims to have a direct, unmediated hotline to divine truth, then the actual written scriptures and the established laws become entirely optional for them. If the traditional text says X is forbidden, but the saint's divine intuition says, I have received direct knowledge that X is permitted for me, the saint's intuition wins out.
Exactly. The critics argue that this elevation of the saints resulted in the complete death of exoteric or outer religion.
Outer religion.
Yeah, the saints essentially divided the religion into two tiers.
Like an inner and outer circle.
Exactly. You had the Sharia, the outer law, which was viewed as basically training wheels for the uninitiated masses. It was necessary to keep the commoners in line. But then you had the Hakika, the ultimate truth, which was reserved only for the elite mystics who had broken through the boundaries.
So once you reach the level of the saint, the training wheels come off.
Precisely. You are no longer bound by the mechanics of prayer or the restrictions of the law because you have merged with the reality that the law was merely pointing toward.
So what does this all mean practically? According to the text, how did this impact everyday religion for the masses?
Well, the source material condemns this division as a catastrophic subversion. It replaced the unmediated worship of God with the veneration of human beings.
That's saints.
Right. The everyday believer, convinced they could never access this secret knowledge themselves, began seeking blessings from the saints, visiting their shrines, and blindly obeying their commands.
Because defying the saint was seen as literally defying God.
Yes. The sources draw a harsh comparison here. They equate this absolute submission to the saints with the practices of early polytheists.
Wow, polytheism.
Or the way certain sects historically elevated their monks and priests to the status of lords beside God.
So the very thing that religion was founded to eradicate human intermediaries monopolizing the divine had been smuggled back in through the back door of mystical enlightenment.
Exactly. It shifted the entire paradigm from a text-based, law-abiding community to a personality-driven cult of secret knowledge.
That is wild.
The authority was no longer located in a public, accessible text that anyone could study. It was locked inside the heart of an infallible human leader.
Okay, let's take a breath and trace the trajectory of what we've unpacked today because it is a profound escalation.
It really is a journey.
We started with al-Bastami making an individual claim of incarnation, the desire to wear the I-ness of God. That single fracture expanded into Ibn Arabi's universe-shattering pantheism, Wadat al-Wujud, where every atom of existence is just a mirror of the divine essence.
Right, and then we saw how that worldview was achieved through the psychological annihilation of the ego in the state of fauna.
The flow state.
Exactly. And from there, we watched the historical mortal prophet mutate into a pre-existent Neoplatonic cosmic entity managing the universe.
And finally, we saw how that cosmic structure centralized absolute, unquestionable power into the hands of the saints, rendering the traditional laws of the religion obsolete.
It is a masterclass in how a single philosophical deviation pushed to its absolute logical extreme can completely consume and rewrite the host religion.
Consume and rewrite.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it feels like.
And, the critics writing these historical texts recognize that. They weren't just arguing over semantics or poetry.
No, they were fighting for the structural survival of their worldview.
They understood that you cannot have a religion based on boundaries if the most revered figures in your society are actively setting those boundaries on fire.
Setting the boundaries on fire. That was such a powerful image to sum this all up.
Yeah, the stakes were just incredibly high.
Well, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Think about the ultimate tension we've explored today between external structure and internal experience.
It's a huge tension.
It really is. Because if a human being truly believes, through a deeply felt, overwhelming psychological state, that they have experienced direct, unmediated contact with the ultimate truth of the universe, can any ancient text, any societal law, or any religious institution ever truly hold authority over them again?
That's the real question.
Once a person believes they have tasted the infinite, how do you convince them to step back inside the box? Keep diving deep.